City Councilor. Today is Tuesday, May 8th. We are here from the Boston Public Schools team to discuss transportation and food services at this session, the 2 p.m. session. I'd like to remind people in the chamber and at home that this is both being broadcast and recorded on RCN Channel 82, Comcast 8, Verizon 1964, and streamed at boston.gov/city-council-TV. I'll ask everybody in the chamber to silence their electronic devices. At the conclusion of the departmental presentation and questions from my colleagues, we will take public testimony. There is a sign-in sheet to my left by the door. I ask that you state your name, affiliation, residence, and check the box if you do wish to publicly testify. We want to encourage all of our residents to participate in our budget review. There are numerous ways to do that. You can come to a hearing such as this and sign up to testify. You can also come to a day that is dedicated to public testimony alone on Tuesday, June 5th, between the hours of 2 and 6 p.m. You can also send by mail to the Committee on Ways and Means, Boston City Hall, 1 City Hall Plaza, Boston, Mass. 02201, and email the committee at ccc.wm@boston.gov. As I mentioned earlier, today's hearing is with the Boston Public School Department operations regarding food service and transportation as they pertain to dockets 0559 through 0563. Orders for the fiscal year 19 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations, annual appropriation for the school department, appropriation for other post-employment benefits, appropriation for certain transportation and public realm improvements, and appropriation for certain park improvements, and dockets 0564 through 0565. Capital budget appropriations, including loan orders and lease and purchase agreements. I am joined by several of my colleagues, and I will introduce them in order of their arrival. To my far left, we have City Councilor at Large Michael Flaherty. Next to him, District City Councilor Tim McCarthy. To my immediate left, the Chair of Education, Councilor Anissa Sabi-George. To my far left again, Councilors Ed Flynn and at-large City Councilor Michelle Wu. And to my far right, District City Councilor Josh Zakum. I want to welcome John and your team to the chamber today, and we'll hand it over to you for your presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Councilor. Thank you for allowing us to present in front of you today. As Councilor mentioned, my name is John Hanlon. I'm the Chief of Operations for Boston Public Schools. I'm joined with me this afternoon by Laura Benavides, Executive Director of Food Nutrition Services, Bill Chung, Acting Director of Finance for Food Nutrition Services, John Roderick, Director of Transportation, and Ed Pesch, Assistant Director of Finance in Transportation. I urge you, if you don't mind, to see me not just as the Chief of Operations for the school district, but also as an alum of Boston Public Schools and as a proud father of 4 children attending schools in the district and the proud husband of a BPS teacher. What we'd like to present to you today is certain information on both transportation and food nutrition services, but I ask of you to also think more broadly of operations and BPS in that it also consists of the facilities department, both building services and planning engineering, safety services, which we will discuss with all of you tonight at a separate budget hearing in the Office of Instructional Informational Technology, as well as the Office of the Ombudsperson and our operational superintendents. With that, before diving into the agenda, I wanted to take a brief pause and give a shout out to our facilities department, specifically people who work in the Environment and Energy Unit and facilities. Earlier today at the State House, Boston Public Schools, along with the Boston Water and Sewer Commission, were given a very prestigious award, only given to 2 school districts this year, for efforts to reduce lead in drinking water in schools. We're very proud of that accomplishment and shows tremendous growth that team has been able to promote for Boston Public Schools and our children over the last couple of years.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Who's the other district, John?
I'll get back to you.
Okay.
Sorry, it escapes me right now.
I guess it doesn't matter.
Reading, I believe it was Reading. Yeah, it was Reading. Sorry about that. Here's our agenda. We'll first talk about BPS transportation. We'll then talk about food and nutrition services. As I'm sure the council is aware, there's also a lengthy appendix full of information that we think might be useful to all of you. As I begin the presentation on transportation, I'll remind the council that we were here just over 2 months ago on February 27th, presenting a mid-year update on transportation spending. You will hear and see some of the same things that you heard and saw on February 27th. As a starting point, as a reminder, transportation spending is driven by a number of factors out of our control. First, as discussed before, school choice certainly is a major factor in our growing costs in transportation. As you can see here, 116 school sites we serve draw students from at least 10 different Boston zip codes. That's just one fact of many that we could pull that shows that Boston's level of school choice far surpasses that of the national average. The costs related to special education are costs that we're very happy to oblige, but they do represent a growing portion of our costs within transportation. In particular, as discussed in February, we have nearly 5,000 students in the school district receiving receiving door-to-door transportation. That means that our school buses are picking them up at their front door. That represents nearly a 7% growth rate since FY12. In addition to that, the number of students with one-to-one bus monitors has grown by 50% since FY16. Our non-BPS obligations, again, things which we've talked about in these chambers, the fact that we transport 9,425 students to over 100 non-BPS sites clearly adds to the costs of our service. Our volume of service in general is very significant, particularly for a school district of our size. We transport roughly 27,000 students every day to nearly 270 unique sites in and out of Boston, and I stress the out of Boston because we do transport a large number of students to private special education facilities outside of the school district. This amounts to roughly 3,000 trips every single day, covering 25,000 miles every single day. And lastly, other factors we've discussed before, in particular costs related to students experiencing homelessness or students in transition. That category of expenses totaled $6.4 million this year. That's our projection. And lastly, our fuel costs are rising. Diesel and propane are up approximately 17% and 24% respectively. This next slide here tells a complicated story that I wanted to take a minute to explain. And you've seen something similar to this chart before. As you can see, the number of BPS corner riders has dropped over time. That's the height of the blue bars. However, more expensive rider types have grown. And so, although because of the efforts related to MBTA passes and home-based assignment, and more recently the Transportation Challenge, which did wonders to reduce the size of our bus fleet and make for more optimized bus routes, our continuing efforts to opt out students from busing if they're not availing themselves of the bus. Although all of those efforts have greatly reduced the size of our corner rider population, these other populations have continued to grow, and those are unfortunately populations that we don't have as much control over. And again, something that we've talked about in these chambers before, and something that we are trying to address. So for example, when we talk about door-to-door ridership within special education, we're working very closely, and we're very proud of this. We're working very closely with the special education department to make sure that students being given those assignments are actually the ones most deserving of that accommodation. This next slide shows that small portions of riders make up large portions of costs. Again, we've displayed this slide to City Council before. Two things that I want to call out here in particular. As mentioned before, BPS door-to-door costs continue to grow. They continue to be an area of growth that we don't have as much control over. What I want to call your attention to right here is that BPS door-to-door riders amount to only about 11% of our total ridership, but roughly 40% of our total costs. And in fact, even though it's only 11% of our ridership, you can see from the chart on the right that it makes up about the same amount of cost as all of our other BPS busing costs combined. The other point that I would raise here, I mentioned that we do transport students from outside of the district. 2 special education facilities outside of Boston. As you can see on the graph on the left, it's a negligible amount of students. However, they amount to 8% of our total costs. This next slide, we're showing that yellow bus expenses comprise 78% of all costs. I've also called out some notable changes from FY18 to FY19, as you can see in the text below. A couple explanations of what you see there. Again, more than 3/4 of our costs are related to yellow bus service. Nearly half of our costs are tied into our driver costs, our driver salaries, our driver benefits. They represent roughly 50% of the entire transportation budget. Within that, for next year, we're expecting an increase of roughly $300,000. That in itself is a little complicated because we do expect there to be more than a $4 million increase in continued door-to-door growth. In addition to that, we're also seeing continued growth in the placement of students in private special education facilities and other costs outside of our control. However, we are continuing the next phase of work related to the transportation challenge by continuing to do what we can to optimize our bus routes. That, we hope, will lead to a $3.8 million savings next year, allowing for that entire area of costs to only amount to a $300,000 increase. In addition to that, as called out above, our bus monitor costs are rising rapidly due to the growth in door-to-door ridership. As a result of that, we're planning for a $1.6 million increase in bus monitor costs between FY18 and FY19. This here is our final slide on transportation. And what it shows is that we are trying everything we can to work on a number of initiatives to reduce overall costs. As mentioned a second ago, we will continue to strive to make our system as efficient as possible without sacrificing safety or on-time performance. Now, on that note, I'm happy to say that the result of the Transportation Challenge earlier this year allowed us to reduce our bus fleet by 50 buses, which was the largest single-year drop that the department had ever had. In addition to that, our on-time performance has stayed competitive with prior years and, in fact, has been better than last year for most of the last 6 months. As mentioned before, we'll also continue to do what we can related to our opt-out campaign. We've actually just begun that again this spring to try to remove students from service if they're not riding the bus. The other points that you see here on this slide, we will continue to do what we can to improve service delivery. One point of note is that we will do everything we can to make sure that we're modernizing our monitor service to bring efficiency and optimization to that unit as we have to our busing unit. For innovation and partnerships, we're very proud of the partnership that we struck with MIT through the Transportation Challenge last year. We are continuing to work with them on innovations that we hope will yield cost savings and improved service in the years to come. And vendor contract management. Clearly, as you can tell, most of our budget is tied up in our yellow busing costs, which are controlled by Transdev, our private contractor, whom we work closely with to deliver service to our school children. It's incumbent upon us to continue to do what we can to improve vendor contract management so that we're holding certain things in check like exception time, which we talked about before, so that drivers are being paid for the time they actually spend driving our students to and from school and not for other time. In addition to that, we're working very closely with Transdev to make sure that drivers are being put back on the road, that drivers are leaving the bus yards on time, and so on and so forth. With that, I'll close out the discussion for transportation, but certainly we will be available to answer as many questions as we can afterwards. And I'd like to pass it to Laura Benavides, our Executive Director of Food Nutrition Services. Laura presented to you before. She is a delight. She's a tremendous leader of this department, and I expect that you'll think the same after hearing from her today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I just want to introduce some of my colleagues that have arrived during your presentation. Council President Andrea Campbell has joined us off to my right, as well as to my immediate right, District City Councilor Matt O'Malley, and to my far right, Councilor Kim Jane. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present an update on food and nutrition services for Boston Public Schools. I wanted to kind of go over this one. Now I'm stuck.
Could be that the battery went.
Okay. having a technical difficulty.
There we go.
There we go, okay.
Yep.
To provide an update on our budget overview and how we build our budgets. So we are a school district that participates in the National School Lunch and School Breakfast programs, as well as provide after-school meals. By participating in these programs, we are required to serve meals that meet federal meal pattern guidelines. And in exchange, the USDA, which administers the program, provides subsidies in USDA foods for each reimbursable meal we serve. So therefore, the majority of our funding and revenue is covered by USDA, and it's generated on a per-student meal basis. The reimbursement received by USDA can increase annually on average between 1% and 2%. However, even with this increase, it does not address escalating costs in food and labor, both of these categories are our two largest expenses that we have seen a continual rise in this year. As part of those costs, this year we embarked on an opportunity to provide a different model of service for our schools that do not have kitchens, which we commonly call satellite schools. We selected Revolution Foods for breakfast and lunch meals, in particular for their fresh food model. We also selected Preferred Meals to provide after-school meals to schools that have after-school programs. Both of these vendors provide prepackaged meals that are of higher quality, but also come at an increased price. We do recognize that there is an overall challenge of providing high-quality food of high nutritional value within budget to all of our students. We continue to focus on being self-sustaining and meet our budget needs based on the federal reimbursements. We have seen a decline in our deficit in the last few years and have relied on less support by the District General Fund, but it increased this year. But because we are driven on a per-meal basis, we focus on participation and where we can make impacts. Our participation rates vary across the district, but depending on the school type or even the type of kitchen. However, they continue to be higher than the national average. But even with our budget challenges, we are committed to decreasing the deficit through improving efficiencies in purchasing, staffing, and strategic planning reviews. We are committed to piloting out different processes to ensure not only we are providing good food to our students, but are efficient in our costs as well. I know I shared a few words about our two new vendors, but I wanted to further highlight the partnership between our two new partners, Revolution Foods for breakfast and lunch meals and Preferred Meals for after-school meals, as an opportunity for us to give students the best meals possible. This is an opportunity to provide a different model of service, to go from frozen meals to meals delivered fresh daily. Each program provides significant benefits to our students and to our staff. It includes fresh options and clean labels, meaning our food has no artificial colors, flavors, sweeteners. These groups are customer service oriented. They have service model flexibility and with locations, and they've introduced new partners such as the Food Corps and the Commonwealth Kitchen here in Boston, and they utilize our local products such as fresh fish and seasonal produce. As I stated, our goal is to be self-sustaining based on federal reimbursements and not use general funding. We build our budget to be based on the estimated number of reimbursable meals served, and our goal every day is to cover all costs by the reimbursement. Our two biggest expenditures cover two areas, food and labor. This year, we are projecting our food costs to be at 56.7% of our revenue at $20.1 million, which is up by 3.7% from last year. And of this budget, 64% is represented by the vended meals program. Labor is a significant cost at 42% of the total budget at $12.1 million, plus benefits at $2.8 million. And all of our other expenses, such as repair, maintenance, facility, paper, is projected at 7.6% of our revenue, a total of $2.3 million. This slide is the overall budget projected for FY18 plus the proposed budget for FY19. It breaks down our revenue and costs further. We are projecting a drop in revenue specifically in breakfast and lunch at 3.8% and 2% respectively. We also anticipate to receive revenue from the State Severe Needs Fund, but because it has not been awarded, we have not added it to our budget. So there is a potential to decrease the deficit as it becomes available, which it has in past years. These issues are resulting in a loss of revenue of $1.045 million. We are projecting an increased expense in food costs related to our two vended meal programs for breakfast and lunch and for after-school meals. Both of these programs result in an added cost of about $594,000 to our budget. Much of this expense is for the procurement of more fresh food for students, which we know has a shorter shelf life. And of this $594,000, $540,000 of it results from an increase in participation by students in the extended learning time schools. This represents a service of an additional 2,800 meals per day. We are also projecting a significant increase in labor costs by $800,000. The increase is from our part-time and full-time cafeteria employees. Of this deficit, $424,000 of it is from 44 employees that were not charged to our budget in 16-17, and therefore we did not account for it properly in our budget in 17-18. In addition, the budget did not recognize the correct union contract pay increase, which resulted in an additional $175,000. This added deficit, the additional added deficit also includes additional hours worked in overtime. We were able to achieve modest savings in the category of other by about $156,000. This category encompasses equipment, purchases, and maintenance. This slide showcases the participation projection of the number of meals served by meal type of breakfast, lunch, and after-school meals. It compares the participation in fiscal years 16, 17, and 18. There are declines in breakfast and lunch, but we are projecting an increase of about 19% in the after-school meal program. And although we've had some challenges in our budget, we've also have opportunities to grow and strategize on other ways we can continue to evolve our department. I'd like to showcase some of the bright spots we have in the strategy planning for next school year. The first bright spot is the Hub and Spoke project we launched in East Boston this year. Our goals for the pilot were to serve fresher food, achieve menu equity, and reduce waste, and above all, improve the dining experience for students. With support of the Shaw Family Foundation, we had a soft launch in spring of 2017, and a full school operation in 4 schools this year at the result of the pilot, which is giving us flexible menus and increased participation. The Hub and Spoke focuses on choice and consumption. We wanted the opportunity to test out different service models that would result in offering students food made from scratch in locations where they only had the ability to provide prepackaged meals. We wanted to expose students to make choices of what they wanted to eat and ensuring that is within our per meal reimbursement budget. Students have loved the opportunity to make choices, and we love that those choices meet reimbursable meal requirements. And by focusing on production, procurement, training, and consumption, we were able to create cost efficiencies on volume of items being produced, the consistency of the menu without impacting the menu quality or freshness, and or participation. In fact, we saw increases in participation and the opportunity to reduce the number of pre-plated meals we've had to purchase. I'm happy to announce that Mayor Walsh will be expanding the Hub and Spoke model to 25 new schools starting this summer. The model, which was now branded and renamed the My Way Cafe, and in Spanish is called Mi Manera. It represents a major Build BPS investment in partnership with the Shaw Family Foundation, Boston Public Schools, and our department and the city's Public Facilities Department. The additional 25 schools are located in the East Boston, Roxbury, and Mattapan neighborhoods. Build BPS has labeled these neighborhoods as high-priority neighborhoods due to demographic and facilities considerations, and we also considered their percentage of economically disadvantaged students, which is higher in these neighborhoods than it is across the district, as well as they had a higher opportunity index. And these particular neighborhoods, we had very high participation, so we know the need for our students is there. Some of our other significant highlights include this year we signed a 4-year contract with our AFSCME union that represents all of our cafeteria employees. It resulted in a 2% increase for staff per year and a switch to weekly paychecks. For FNS, we were able to obtain a meals per labor hour formula that provides the number of labor hours needed to support each cafeteria based on variables such as lunch periods, enrollment, school type, and meal type. In addition, we have moved away from the bid process for hiring staff, so we now have the opportunity to interview both internal and external candidates and offer entry-level permanent positions. Another focus for this year was breakfast in the classroom and breakfast after the bell. The proposed legislation was assigned to the Senate Committee on Ways and Means in April. It requires schools with 60% or more students eligible for free and reduced price meals to serve breakfast after the bell. And I continue to envision breakfast after the bell to be an opportunity to build the number of students who eat morning meal at school. Whether it is after the bell or on their way to class, we continue to work with schools to customize a model that works best. It is an opportunity to prepare our students for school. This year, we were able to add 2 new locations to provide breakfast in the classroom, as well as 5 new locations that were piloting out breakfast after the bell options. We are focused for next year to include as many of our new My Way Cafe schools to launch these initiatives along with their new cafeteria. And another bright spot, through the support of the Kendall Foundation, we have become members of the Urban School Food Alliance. This group is led by the 6 largest districts in the country that are focused on changing how we can purchase items for our school meal programs to leverage our purchasing power to drive quality up and costs down, which are other ways we're looking to continue to focus on driving our costs down. And BPS along with BPS, along with the Mayor's Office of Food Access, received a $150,000 award from the American Beverage Association to have the opportunity to improve access to fresh fruits and vegetables among our BPS students through increased participation in and consumption of school meals. Through this award, we are focused on student and parent engagement to solicit input into the school meal programs. The goal of this program and award is to make all students feel as though school meals are a good option for them. We will continue to focus this year to drive down our costs and to ensure our students benefit from enjoyable, healthy meals at school. We are focused on our processes to implement My Way Cafe, utilize our purchasing power to drive down our costs, also implement breakfast in the classroom or breakfast after the bell options, but also to continue elevating our quality and continue to market our program to students. Thank you.
Thank you. Does that conclude?
That concludes our presentation, yes. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And we've been joined by District City Councilor Frank Baker off to my right, and off to my left, at-large City Councilor Ayanna Presley. Again, I'm going to ask my colleagues, I'm going to cut you at 5 minutes on the first round because there's many people here, including myself. On the labor costs on page 12, it looks like, thanks. You're projecting almost a $2 million plus labor cost savings. How are we getting to that in light of, raises and everything else? Are we reducing the workforce, or? And I'm comparing it to, the FY18 actuals, where it says 14.9 million, and then proposed budget for 19.
So the proposed budget is what we currently have in our process. It doesn't include some of these new additions that we have. So it's not official yet. I know that it is a distinctive difference, but it's something that we're still modeling some of our changes, including how we're utilizing the My Way Cafe, of how we can be able to minimize some of our costs in labor with the new model.
Okay, the hub and spoke model.
Yes, the hub and spoke model.
Okay, so that is that demonstrated to be a place that we can save money on food?
Yes, based on the information that we have on our 4 schools, and I presented to the school committee a few weeks ago, we are seeing a higher cost in labor, but a lower cost in the food cost, in the cost of the food, because of the tighter controls in production and the tighter controls in consumption.
Okay, so I'm not trying to be combative here, but it seems like your food costs stay about the same, at least on this slide. The food costs are about the same, but the labor cost goes down significantly. So, maybe offline, or you can follow up with, how we're arriving at that significant labor cost savings.
Yes, I will do that. Thank you.
I'm going to shift to transportation. And John, this came up obviously at the last hearing we had, sponsored by Councilor Asabi George. The contract, TransDev contract, is up June 30th. Can you give us an update on where we are in that process to either extend them or not? And then before you answer, again, looking at slide 35, the year that we took them on as a vendor, the cost went up $20 million from 2013 to 2014, the year that we, exacted that contract. And then it seems to have leveled out, but that was a 22% increase in 1 year, and it was from the contractor, I'm assuming. So if you could kind of give me some background on that.
For sure. I'd like to answer your second question first, and then I'll get to your first. The reason why there's such a jump in costs the first year that TransDev came into the contract with Boston Public Schools is simply a result of the nature of the contract. So prior to TransDev taking that work, the contract had a cap on expenses, and if the vendor went over that threshold for expenses, then the vendor needed to incur those costs on their own and not be reimbursed by the school district or the city. When that contract was winding down, we released an RFP under those same terms, and because this is a relatively small industry with only a certain number of players involved, the national landscape following this understood that the prior vendor was operating at a loss for multiple years because of the nature of the contract. When we put that document out to bid, no one bid on the work because of that restriction in there that there would be a finite cap on expenses, which would then most likely lead to the vendor operating at a loss. In order to attract competition and interest, we removed that condition in a subsequent round of RFP, and that then is what yielded a good response from a number of vendors, including TransDev. TransDev came in roughly, I believe, $10 to $12 million below the incumbent in terms of the management fee they were looking to charge the district. They were extremely competitive in their proposal at the time, and quite frankly, they've done a good job over the last 5 years. And so, again, answering that second question first, that's why there's such a jump in cost. It's not necessarily because of the vendor who was here, but more so because of the contract that had been in place at that time.
Okay.
As for the contract for the vendor contract, I should say, for next year, we've already begun and have nearly completed the process of extending TransDev for another year. As part of that contract with TransDev, formerly Veolia, it was a 5-year contract with a series of 1-year options at the city's discretion. Knowing what we see from the landscape, knowing that TransDev was far lower than the next most responsible bidder during the last round, knowing that we're about to embark upon driver negotiations with our drivers union, and knowing about some of the growth that they've shown us over this year in particular, especially after the arrival of a new general manager at TransDev, we felt it most prudent to extend them for another year at this time.
Okay. All right, thank you. Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, John, and your team here.
Thank you.
So you reduced 50 buses. That was for last year, or is that for this year? And if it's for last year, do we have any reduction in this year?
Planned for next year, I'm sorry?
Yes, yeah, moving forward.
Yeah, we don't know what that number is right now, but as mentioned, we continue to work with MIT. We continue to refine the algorithm that they constructed for us to help our bus routing. We do believe that there will be a further drop in the size of our fleet, but we don't yet know at this time exactly what that will be. It's all very dynamic and dependent on where students go to school, and we won't have the final enrollment data for another month and a half.
Gotcha. And then if this, I don't know if you have the ability to go back to slide, looks like it was page 5. A little confusing. You talked about sort of the 11% makes up the whole. So 11% is, children make up 11% of the overall budget. I think that's the comment you made. Can you explain that one for me? That graph. That chart.
Yeah, so the number of transported students. So we transport something north of 40,000 students every day through MBTA or Yellow Bus. Our door-to-door students comprise nearly 11% of that number. However, even though they're only 11%, so roughly 1/10 of all of the students we transport, they amount to roughly 40% of our costs.
I think you go to slide 7, 2 more over. The top line, reducing the number of routed students who never ride the bus. Was that was a situation I think I had described years ago when my children were assigned to a bus even though we had refused transportation, but yet that seat was reserved for my kids for the entire school year. So
Correct.
Is that still happening? And if so, how do we catch up on that? I would assume the first week or two of school, we kind of know who's on and who's not, and then we kind of recalculate. Is that how it works?
You're right. So it was around this time last year where we launched really the first very sophisticated attempt to remove students from service who are not riding the bus. We call it our opt-out campaign. By law, we're required to provide transportation to those students who meet the eligibility guidelines for transportation, and we have to continue to do so until or unless we get parental consent or guardian consent to remove them from service. We identified last year through a lengthy process and working closely with our schools to understand from their bus rosters, every bus has a roster, who's riding and who's not. We compiled a list of 2,000 students who are not regularly riding the bus at all over the entire course of the 16-17 school year. We then launched a call center starting in June that we operated until the middle of the summer, where we called every single one of those families, and in some cases we needed to call them multiple times to reach them. Unfortunately, when we were successful in reaching those families, we found that only about half were willing to actually remove their children from service. And so we identified roughly 2,000 students who never rode the bus. That yielded, though, only 1,000 students' seats being freed up from service. We then again did that in the beginning of this school year. As you said, sometimes it only takes a couple weeks for you to understand who's going to be riding the bus and who's not. That then yielded more results in the fall. I can't speak to the data from that, but we had a very similar approach working closely with schools to understand who's riding, who's not. We called families, we removed more kids from service. In that time of year, when we're doing that, the upshoot of that is more to improve service and timeliness of transportation. It's not necessarily going to improve costs because the costs are already set by the driver's bid. We're now starting that first process all over again. Now that it's the spring, we're going to be launching the call center over the next couple weeks. We're already getting data from schools on a ridership. We will continue to do this as much as we can so that we can remove these students from service. And we always promise to parents, if you opt out, you can always opt back in, and we will get you back into service as quickly as we can.
Gotcha. Are there any situations where there'd be a child on two bus routes, say like one parent living in one neighborhood and another parent living in another neighborhood where that would happen, or is the parent had to select one route for the child?
In some cases, when we're making these phone calls, we have to be very careful about that in terms of custody and
Right.
so on and so forth. So we try to work that through very closely with our legal and equity departments when we launch this call center, so that we have those I's dotted and T's crossed. It doesn't come up very often, though, to be frank.
And are any parents Ubering or lifting or ride sharing their kids to school that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. It might be happening, but not that I'm aware of.
And then you're partnering with out-of-school districts. Has there been any thought to partnering with some of those types of companies to see whether or not they could help reduce transportation costs? Obviously, clearly getting kids there safely is of paramount importance and timely. Didn't know whether or not any thought has been given to any of these companies that do it, and are they doing it in sort of in a bus capacity, if you will, as opposed to just in a sedan capacity?
There seems to be a growing industry in that space. Companies like Shepherd and Zemcar, not just the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. We are not, as a school district, we are not able to partner with them directly by driver's contract. Our drivers need to be the ones transporting our students. By law, we need to be transporting students in highly regulated vehicles. So we cannot broker those relationships. If families do that on their own, then that's certainly up to them, and they have that freedom to do that.
Great. And then on slide 22.
Last question?
Yes, on transportation, 22 as the pre-parochial.
Yes.
So who is that? How does that happen? So we're basically transporting parochial school children to school.
Correct.
Is it a sped situation, or
No.
it's just, okay.
So there are, as you can see, there are 326 private parochial students attending, typically Catholic schools across Boston. We're transporting them to school and from school every day.
Okay. And then just my
That's a
nutrition-
law that we
My
are
one
against.
nutrition question, Mr. Chairman, just to Laura, is you explained in detail the hub and spoke program. How are they chosen? So what was the sort of the metrics that went into, it started in East Boston, and now we're going to open up 25 schools in Roxbury, Mattapan. What do we say to parents and children that are in schools all across the city? If they live in Alston, Brighton, if they live in West Roxbury, if they live in Charlestown, is a spoken will come into their school soon, or?
That's a great, for me, if I had my way, we would be doing it all the entire week at one time. Logistically, we cannot. We focus on looking at, The schools that were labeled by Build BPS as with neighborhoods that were challenging, and then also taking in a lot of our other factors such as the opportunity index, as well as the free and reduced price meal eligibility rate and our participation. We do have a lot of other districts, a lot of other neighborhoods that are close to, but those were the things that we looked at, we focused on first. But we can share that we want to have our families and our communities know that we want to be able to focus to expand it across the district, especially as we are seeing it as opportunities to increase participation but lower our costs.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and we've been joined by Councilor Lydia Edwards. Chair recognizes Councilor Tim Flaherty.
Tim Flaherty?
Tim McCarthy.
Yeah, Mike's cousin, Tim Flaherty. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll move quickly, unlike my cousin. So, 50 less buses, I'm very happy about that. I'll stick with transportation for a little bit here. On-time percentage is 90%. How are we working to get that higher? 90% is great on a test, but if you're one of those 10% families, you're running late. So how are we doing on that?
I guess I'd answer that question in two parts. Certainly, we're doing everything we can to improve that. We're proud of the fact that despite some significant changes to our busing system this year, we were able to maintain a relatively high on-time percentage on par with previous years and slightly better than last year. We will continue to do what we can with that. One of our efforts right now from a technical standpoint is to make sure that we're updating the map that feeds into the routing engine that we use, this routing software called Versatrans. And right now we're trying to make sure that that map is as updated as possible and also as dynamic as possible. Right now we don't have as much flexibility across the morning and afternoon to reset the actual travel speeds that our buses would find when they're out on the roads. We're right now held to travel speeds from years ago, so we're in the process of trying to update that. From a less technical and more factors beyond our control side of it, we also have an issue with every morning we have a standby bid that sometimes takes 30 to 45 minutes for those drivers who are not available that day for their routes to be bid on by other drivers who are available. That also holds us back by not allowing us to get the buses out of the yards as quickly as possible. And on that note, we continue to suffer slightly with yard departure rates that right now are still hovering around 40 to 50% of buses leaving our bus yards on time. We're continuing to do what we can to work with Transdev and ultimately work with our drivers to make sure that they're doing what they can to get out of the yard, to have efficient standby processes to show up to drive every day.
I know that it's brand new, but this is more of a heads up than anything else. On Washington Street in Rosendale, we now have the dedicated bus lane. It'd be interesting to see if you could keep the data on time rates of the buses that utilize that path. Michelle Wu and I were out there this morning, and the buses are zipping from Rosendale Village right up through Forest Hills. And I'm curious to see if there's better on time with that, and that might be able to be reflected in other possible bus lanes throughout the city. I know you had, we talked about GPS tracking before. Are those on the buses now?
Correct. Those are on the buses. They went into our buses at the time of the last collective bargaining agreement with the busing union. So they are on our buses. We use it when so-called qualifying events occur behind the wheel, such as accidents or speeding or safety incidents related to the driver or the students on board. We are not allowed to use it per the contract to discipline drivers, to monitor driving on a regular basis. It's part of the reason why the exception time issue we discussed before has been somewhat of a problem in recent years, because we cannot use the data to combat that.
As far as the bus drivers themselves, these are more just pet peeves. I know you and I have talked at length about when they stop and just randomly are waiting for somebody. Two things. One, can we keep them off the sidewalks? Because Boston, as an old public works guy, they destroy the concrete, especially on newer poured concrete. So I think that the Public Works Department will probably go after you a little bit on some of that. They do destroy the concrete sidewalks I made for buses of that weight. And then the second thing is cut-throughs. I don't know if other councils have had issues, but I know that specifically in Hyde Park, as all the buses come back to Reedville, all of the buses don't stay on the main road. So like Child Street in particular, all of the buses will go down Summer as where the GRU school is. They'll take the right, and then they'll take the left onto Child Street. And literally, if you're on Child Street, there is 100+ buses going in about 45-minute period, bus after bus after bus. And those neighbors are just losing their mind as diesel fuel fills up their street. So we keep an eye on that. And then the last thing I have is, am I still good? Okay. The last thing for the nutrition. A lot of the teachers I've talked to in District 5 have commented about the throwaway policy with food. A lot of them are concerned because by policy, they're forced to throw away food that's actually good. Oranges, bananas, apples. How can we address that? Because I know that a lot of the teachers are probably not following that rule, keeping the fruit and then giving to kids later on, giving to them on Fridays on the way home. How do we address that?
So the official regulation is through the USDA, is that in order for us to be a safe program, we want to make sure that the food is provided and served in a safe manner to children. So once it is served to children, we can create share tables, which we do have them in cafeterias. We also, when schools are participating or classrooms participating in breakfast in the classroom, they have a small bins that they're able to utilize and put things that are left over. But the expectation is that if the children don't pick it up by the end of the day, we want to throw it away. That is what our regulations are in order to maintain safety for our students.
Okay.
And I understand and I hear the plight
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
concern.
It's ridiculous to throw away a good apple after a day.
So we're trying to work through some of those things, especially even as we're looking at as programs such as the My Way Cafe, because it's really focuses on consumption, and so children are actually taking what they want, so that really creates a lot of less waste.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Asabi George.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for being here. And John, I appreciate that hearing in February. I think you did cover a lot of ground. So hopefully we'll make today quicker, and I know I play a big role in that. Councilor Sioma was asking about the TransDev contract. We did extend that by another year.
Yes.
At school committee, and we have the ability to extend that how many more times before another negotiation?
There are 5 one-year options. This is the first of those. After this year, we would have the option again 4 more times over.
And what's the likelihood, or what's the history in renewing or in utilizing those one-year options?
Well, I can say from the marketplace standpoint, it's oftentimes beneficial for school districts to extend, particularly in light of growing costs elsewhere. If that's the case, it's certainly something that we need to consider. Peter Crossan from our team, who's here today, led a lot of that work to do a market analysis earlier this year, so that we were very, very stringent in making a decision to extend or not to extend. At that time, it was a very logical it was very logical to make that decision and extend them. We could be in the same situation next year. It's premature right now to say.
Can we, although we're doing the extension of the option, is there any opportunity to negotiate even small pieces of the contract with TransDev?
We cannot change the contract because they're still by procurement law operating under the exact same contract that we started with them 5 years ago. That's simply a matter of procurement law. We can and do work with them on a regular basis to make sure that they're bringing improvements to bear, as they did earlier this year.
And then where are we with any, with the contract with the bus drivers? Where do we stand in the timeline?
That contract is expiring June 30th of this year. We're going to begin contract negotiations over the next 2 weeks.
Is there an estimated length of time that we think that will take?
I hope that this is no indication, but last year it took a year and a half.
Okay.
Last time around it took a year and a half.
Okay, thank you. There were some questions in another hearing about the cost of educating some of our students outside of the district. What's the average cost of transporting those kids that leave the district for school, whether it's special ed, vocational ed, or other reasons?
It's actually still on the slide that's being presented right now, the private special education group. Right now, we transport about 166 students, according to the data that we have, and it costs us roughly $57,000 per student to transport those children.
All right, and that includes kids that are in state state involved or state custody that might require
I'm sorry, that's a
transportation?
separate pool. So students experiencing homelessness or students in transition, that's a separate pool of roughly $6.4 million.
Okay.
That would not show up here because they're not transported along with the private special education students. They're a different category.
Okay, and is there another category of kids? Because there was in our special ed hearing last week, there was a line item on, and I can go back and ask it later on, but just other kids that are state involved for other purposes. But I'll go back and check my notes.
Okay.
So we don't get hung up on that. In our February hearing, it was anticipated that we would be spending about $123 million on transportation for this current fiscal year, which is about $7 million over what we approved last year. Is that still the plan? Has that number changed at all?
Ed, why don't you present the updated deficit and some of the changes that maybe have taken effect in the last few months?
So the projected deficit right now has come down slightly. It was hovering around that 123. Our current projection is 122.4. So things have improved. A number of initiatives, such as what we've been doing with exception time, where we saw hours on a weekly basis go down from about 2,500 to, I think they're trending around 1,300. So that's the main driver. Yeah.
Okay. And then with the bell time conversation last year, there was some of that conversation revolved around a potential savings. What would that savings have been if that new schedule went into play?
If you don't mind, I'm going to pull on information that we had shared with City Council before to make sure that I'm repeating the exact same numbers from previously. As we had discussed before, we expected to save roughly $3 to $5 million near term. That would have been effective next year, that could have been reinvested in classrooms. And it is important to note, as I get to that point, that in all of our public discussions related to this, we were very clear that this was not about savings, this was about taking money from transportation and reinvesting in other expenses for the school district. We would have saved roughly $3 to $5 million near term. However, long term, that could have likely been more than $12 million. And the reason why there's such a difference is because there are fixed costs and there are variable costs. When we take variable costs off of the road, we're simply taking off the cost of the vehicles, which includes the drivers, the vehicles themselves, the fuel costs, so on and so forth. But over time, the more vehicles you take off the road by making for a more efficient system, you then begin to think about bus yards and other large fixed expenses that we have very little control over. And so in the short term, we would maybe only save 50% of what the long-term potential would be. In addition to that, the estimate of 3 to 5 is less than 50% of 12 because we knew that we would have had to hold on to some of the savings, partly to make sure that we had taken every precaution to ensure that there was still reliable service on the road, that we were providing enough drivers to cover service if there were any delays or other emergencies or problems with routes. Secondly, we needed to make sure that if there did need to be conversations about a reduction in force, that we would have funds available potentially to negotiate that with the drivers if necessary.
What is the, thank you for that explanation. What was the added cost for ELT now that it's rolled out to all of the schools that will participate in ELT?
From a transportation perspective, it's hard to say. I don't know if we've ever looked at the data that way. Certainly because our schools are now dismissing later in the day, closer to rush hour, there is a cost associated with that, but it's extremely difficult to isolate, when 57 schools moved 40 minutes later, what did that mean for expenses? It's hard to isolate that from all of the other factors that drive cost growth in transportation. Well,
do we know if buses are extending their day on the return back? So the latest school that gets out is now at 4:10 or 4:15. So they're in that rush hour traffic, returning to the bus yard, and then they're adding to our extended time costs or whatever you had explained to us in the February hearing. Has that number gone up with the rollout of those 4 o'clock, 4:10 dismissals?
Yes, for sure. As mentioned, because 3:30 schools are now dismissing at 4:10, we are going to have many more buses every day that are on the roads in the middle of rush hour, more so than we would have last year. We do also know, for what it's worth, from data that the difference in traffic between 3:45 and 4:15 in this city isn't as dramatic as people typically assume, because rush hour begins so early on the streets of Boston. But yes, it has had an impact. I just don't have the data in front of me as to how many more buses are out for longer periods of time in the afternoon than they were before.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Flynn.
Thank you, Councilor CMO. Thank you, Laura. I do have a couple of questions. As it relates to the summertime, what type of nutritional programs do you have for students in public housing that are close to schools? You know, I represent, whether it's Mary Ellen McCormick, Old Colony, West Broadway, Villa Victoria, Cathedral, Castle Square. A lot of the schools are right next to public housing developments. Do we have any nutritional programs for students in these BHA areas?
Yes, we participate in the Summer Food Services Program, so we provide some meals in the summer for those children, because when school is out doesn't mean they're not going hungry. So we are in a variety of areas in the district. We have about probably a little over 100 sites that we serve for breakfast and lunch in the summer. And we will focus on, if there's any interested sites that we want, that we can be able to sponsor, we can have that opportunity to provide more, have that option. You give them our information and we can see if we are having a program that's close to where they are at, or if it's something that we could be able to sponsor as well.
How many students do you provide meals for during the summertime?
Probably about 10,000 meals a day over the summer. It's not as much as we do in the school year, but it's still a significant impact.
Along with nutritional programs, do you provide any other services to them at that period of time?
Well, the only one we do participate for summer is the breakfast and lunch for the summer school program.
Thank you. And I have one question on transportation. As it relates to transporting special needs students, door-to-door transportation, door and wheelchair assistance, I noticed in the city there's a lot of, when they're dropping the students off at the school, a lot of the sidewalks and the ramps are not ADA compliant. Some of the streets are in rough shape. The ramps are not clearly paved. I also see a lot of dedicated workers from BPS helping lift these wheelchairs to get the students into the school. Do we have a list of schools that are, or sidewalks that are not ADA in compliance, and what challenges that makes it difficult for transporting these students? Do we have a list?
We do not have a list. We certainly can take a look at that. We are constantly, between our team and TransDev's team, out monitoring the safety of our bus stops, of other issues related to what you're bringing up. We can certainly add that into the mix of things that we will explore for sure.
You have noticed that a lot of the drop-off areas for the students are not ADA compliant, though, right? Have you noticed that?
I'm sure the team has. I cannot speak to that myself, but certainly it's something that we can work with Public Works on to remedy if we can.
Have you guys noticed that?
No, I haven't noticed it. I've been to a few sites, but if I see something, maybe I'll just survey some of them now, but no, I haven't noticed it.
Yeah, that'd be important to take an inventory to see what ramps are not working, what sidewalks aren't working, and also these dedicated professionals that are assisting these students onto the sidewalk. They're real heroes in the city, so I see them every day. So I just want to say thank you to those workers as well. That they're really the people that keep our schools going.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Silmo, and thank you guys for being here and for all that you do. I know it's not easy work. Just following up on Councilor Flynn's request, if we don't have one, it would be great to have a list of schools that are ADA compliant, and not just when you're entering the buildings. There are some schools you go to, and I'll use Boston International for one as an example. You can only stay in the first level. And how I know this, I had my newborn in a stroller, and I was going to visit, and we were restricted to the first level. We couldn't go anywhere else in the building. And of course, naturally, you have to think about those who are in wheelchairs or who have other disabilities. So I would love to see the list of schools that are ADA compliant and those that are not, with the hopes and expectation that we can do something with respect to that. And I know it's not just within our purview, it involves the state and the federal government, but it is important, so thank you to my colleague, Councilor Flynn. Just going back to a couple things related to transportation, and I know we had the hearing that Councilor Sabi George sponsored in February that I think everyone attended. At that time, we discussed the students, the 166 students that are transported to districts outside of the city of Boston, and how it's a price tag of $57,000 per student. There was some conversation about BPS talking with some of these receiving districts to see if we could split costs. Where are we with respect to that?
Sure. So unfortunately, we're not much further along from where we were in February. We do know that we're getting assistance from the state on trying to make sure that, the state being the one that watches all of this and knowing who's transporting whom to which sites, they've been willing, and this has been a recent development since February, they've been willing to try to broker those discussions between districts so that if, for example, we and Braintree are both transporting students to the North Shore, we can share in those costs. That's not yet something that we have formally contracted with other school districts for, but certainly it's something that's still in our minds.
How many receiving districts are there of those 166 students? Just curious in terms of the magnitude. If it's 3 receiving districts, it's a conversation with the state, Boston, and those 3, but if it's a lot more, that's obviously a heavier lift.
Yeah, and to be clear too, what we would be talking about here in terms of receiving districts being the location where those sites are, there are dozens of them across Massachusetts.
For those 166 students?
You can actually go to the.
Do we know how many, John?
The slide before, there's 63 different sites
63.
for this 166 students.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But the districts we would work with wouldn't necessarily be those districts. They would be districts who are also transporting students a great distance to those sites.
Can the conversation be twofold, also with the receiving districts, or no?
It could, but ultimately it's our responsibility to bear the cost as the host district for the student, and by law, that's where the cost resides. Similarly, there are some students who attend our Horace Mann School for the hearing impaired in Boston, and we know that there are other districts who send their students to Boston for that service, and they bear the responsibility for those costs.
Look forward to hearing more about that, John. And then going back to the contract, so there are 2 contracts. One is for the drivers and another is for the services. We just extended the one for the services by the 1-year option. Until when?
That would expire at this point on June 30th, 2019.
And that contract totals what?
So the contract itself is, all the expenses are passed through. What we actually pay Transdev as a management fee, it's called, is around $2.9 million, and that increases, by a CPI increase every year. But in terms of other costs, whatever it takes them to operate is just a pass-through to, operationalize the whole.
What do you mean?
If it costs us $50 million to employ all the drivers,
Yep.
Transdev encumbers those costs, and then we reimburse Transdev for all costs. So
And
all
they pay
costs-
the drivers through the driver's contract?
The driver's contract is technically with Transdev. Transdev is our
So they're
third-party
negotiating these
vendor,
2.
and there are 3 union contracts: the drivers, dispatchers, and other operators, and then mechanics. So I guess it's one third-party contract, and they employ all these individuals.
And Counselor, another way to look
Yep.
at it is if you look at the chart on slide 6, that shows our cost breakdown of our budget. Everything in blue is related to our busing service, and essentially that amounts to the costs that Transdev bears.
Right.
As Ed mentioned, many of those costs are then reimbursed by Boston Public Schools.
Got it. And so my question at the last transportation hearing was this idea of, the RFP is written in such a way that you can only receive certain types of vendors. So an Uber, for example, can't reply to an RFP because it's designed in such a way that they're ineligible. So the thought was, why not put out an RFI just to get a sense of what ideas exist out there to not only provide adequate and safe and reliable transportation, but transportation that would also reduce this overall budget from $120 million. Right now, I'm frankly a little disappointed that we extended the contract for another year without having put out an RFI or something that gets at what are the other ideas that exist, not just in Massachusetts or in the country, maybe in the world, that might be able to provide not only reliable, great transportation, but save us millions of dollars that we could later, reinvest in something else, food programs for all of our schools. So I'm just curious. I'm curious about two things. One is, are we able to put out an RFI to elicit responses from different type of vendors on what they might be able to do when it comes to BPS transportation? And then the second piece is a follow-up to something that was said earlier about us being prohibited by law from using certain type of vendors. I'd be curious to learn more about that. But I guess the first question and then the second question.
Sure. The reasons why we wouldn't be able to release an RFI for the types of services you're describing are twofold. Number one, and they actually go hand in hand with your second question. Number one, through our collective bargaining agreement with our drivers, the drivers union is formally recognized as the only group allowed to perform the service that we're providing for our students in Boston. Secondly, the pupil transportation industry is one of the most highly regulated industries in the nation, and as a result of that, we need to abide by laws that require us to provide service in certain kinds of vehicles, including the yellow buses that we service. We could not legally, until law changes, have a contractual relationship with the companies such as Uber or Lyft or Zemcar or Shepherd because by law we're required to transport these students in certain kinds of vehicles.
Well, what's to say that another vendor can't provide those type of vehicles? I mean, we don't know what other vendors might be able to do because we've never reached out. So I'm finding it hard to, so right now, you're telling me there are laws on the books that restrict us from putting out a request of information to find out or to gather what might be out there?
I don't think that there are laws in the books that would prevent us from doing that.
That's my question. And that's what I would like to see, because I think that gives us a sense of what is possible in this space. Right now, we have no clue because we're relying on RFP that is limited in its nature to only solicit responses from certain types of companies to deliver certain transportation. And we're restricted from hearing from anyone else in the community who might have more ideas with respect to this. And on the driver's piece, I get that we're in a contract with drivers right now. So unless there's something in that contract that prohibits us from putting out an RFI, which I doubt that, if there is, I'd like to see it because I think that's problematic. We will keep talking about the same thing over and over again. What we talked about in February, we're talking about again now, and then we'll be talking about this in the next budget year. And by that point, this contract or this budget line item will be not $120 million, it'll be a lot more. And I'm not raising my voice at you, John, but just the process and the way in which we're doing things with respect to this transportation budget. And for me, this is frustrating because we keep talking about the same thing. I think if we put out an RFI, we put the onus on people in the community to send us thoughts and ideas, understanding we don't always have it always figured out internally as to what might be possible, where we might be able to save. And then we get into the ugly work of deciding if there's something that we want to pursue or if we want to stick with what we have. But I think by continuing to renew options every year and not exploring what is out there, we're just doing the same thing and over again. The money keeps going up. We can't put the cap in. Maybe with another vendor, we could put a cap in, who knows? But I think if we keep it in our current RFP, we're not going to see something else, and it's going to make it very difficult for us to then expect this budget overall to go down. And that's what bothers me. We're going to keep coming here, talking about the same thing, and getting, frankly, no savings. There's points of frustration I think some of my colleagues share. I guess my time is up. I'm getting an eye. Thank you. And on the food work, this is incredible. Of course, I would love to see the fresh food programs expanded to every school, but I love that you guys are using the Opportunity Index to identify those schools most in need. But of course, every student needs great food, but maybe we can someday get transportation dollars to pour into these initiatives so every school has fresh food, but here we go. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, last December, there was a proposal to radically change the school start times at many, many schools. I know it was well-intentioned. I obviously had a lot of concern and opposed it, and it was decided that would, BPS would withdraw that plan and begin a sort of a better, more transparent, robust public process. Is that begun? I guess the question is, has that begun? And if not, John, can you assure us that there will be no changes to school start times in September?
There will be no changes to school start times in September unless there are some extraneous situations, school-related, if a school loses grant funding for extra time, something like that.
Yeah.
Yes, there will be no changes.
And then is your shop still looking at having sort of a robust public process, or is that on hold for now?
It's been on hold since December. There have been no meaty discussions related to this, no plan in place for how and when to engage the public again. Certainly, it's not ever far from the backs of our minds. And as Dr. Chang had mentioned in his letter to the community, it's something that we do need to reconsider at another time. We just have not made decisions yet on what that time will be.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not advocating for that to begin, but I would reiterate, and it sounds like we're on the same page, that if indeed that conversation is opened up again, then we have as long of a process as necessary to just work with families, work with schools, work with the communities going forward, because I think that was part of certainly my opposition to it earlier. And on that end, and this somewhat goes into transportation, there was some talk about the need for grade configurations. I know the superintendent believes we have too many. I actually agree with him on this point, but we're not looking at changing any grade configurations for the 2018-19 school year. Is that correct?
As far as I know, that is correct.
Okay. And what would that be an act of the school committee to happen? Could that just be a policy change? How?
I believe, but please don't quote me on this, I believe that it does not need to be an act of the school committee, but when we have done that in the past, we have presented that to school committee.
Okay, well, again, I just ask that we keep it as, and I'm sure we're on the same page here, it's just a transparent process as possible. On school nutrition, thank you, and you've done some great work. There was a report in the Globe either yesterday or Sunday. It was the Ending Hunger, it referenced the Ending Hunger in Our Classrooms report, which a nonprofit that I hadn't heard of, but a Boston-based nonprofit had conducted with urban districts, pointed out New Bedford, Springfield, Holyoke, Brockton were at or above 80% of students participating, yet in Boston, where I wrote down the quote because I knew we were having this thing, BPS, quote, has made nearly no headway in achieving the goal, as slightly fewer than half of the system's approximately 55,000 students are eating breakfast in class. And that seems to be borne out by your statistics that it's actually a slight decrease. Can you talk about that and how we can fix that? Because obviously I know we all know the benefits of having a breakfast is vital to learning.
Absolutely. So yeah, the report is correct. So the information is that we did drop in our participation for breakfast. It was my focus for this year to be part and include as many schools that are interested in changing their models of service for either breakfast after the bell or breakfast in the classroom. We did start out immediately in the school year with 2 new schools that had changed their models to be breakfast in the classroom. And as we had our interviews and had our conversations, and we brought in a whole new a person in a position to focus on breakfast in the classroom or breakfast after the bell options, we got to the middle of the school year, and at that point, it was more difficult to have schools change their times to be able to meet this model. So we regrouped, And we're focusing on for this year, as we're changing our models through the My Way Cafe, as options to make sure that we're including that as opportunities for children to have access to breakfast in the classroom or after the bell. And part of that is, as we're looking at it, is that with the My Way Cafe and children making choices, it's a little bit contradictory in breakfast in the classroom, because the breakfast is provided to the child and in the classroom versus when they come to the cafeteria and they're able to make a choice. So we're working through those logistics to making sure that we're continuing to, again, provide access to breakfast.
And I appreciate that. So what's the hope for September of 18?
So the hope for September is that we're rolling out these additional 25 plus the other 5 locations for the My Way Cafe, that they will be doing a version of breakfast in the classroom or breakfast after the bell.
So what percentage of BPS students will then be getting breakfast?
Well, all students have access to breakfast, but we hope to increase that. I can't give you that actual number because I don't know the total enrollment.
And I get the desire, the My Way Cafe sounds fantastic. I wish we had it when I was a student at BPS. But I think the mere logistics would dictate, for some schools, you have to eat in the classroom. That's how Brockton, others, Holyoke, New Bedford have been able to hit those rates. So, and I come from a family of teachers, 2 of whom, would serve breakfast in the classroom, and it does just have such a positive benefit. So I agree with you that the ideal scenario would be to utilize a communal space, have more options, be more culturally competent, certainly, but until we have that luxury, I think we really need to use all tools that we have. So my time is up, but I appreciate it, and we'll look forward to future rounds.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. Councilor Jane.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. I have questions regarding transportation and the food services. I will start by saying that I'm very excited about the change with the food services. I think that provides a great opportunity to provide healthy food. Was wondering which schools in Roxbury we will see this rollout in?
I actually have a list.
Oh, great.
So the Roxbury neighborhood is the largest neighborhood that we'll be rolling out, so it'll be the last neighborhood in the phase. But it's Boston Day and Evening Academy, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Charter Elementary, Ellis Elementary, Fenway High School, Hale Elementary, Haynes Early Education Center, the Hernandez K through 8, Higginson Elementary, Higginson Lewis, the Madison Park Vocational High School, Mason Elementary, Mendel Elementary, Orchard Gardens, and the Tobin. And I'm more than happy to send this list to you.
Yes, if you could, that would be great. So that's wonderful. I'm wondering, with menu options, do students participate in making suggestions as to what they would like to see, and how do you take into account the student demographics in terms of their cultural and ethnic backgrounds, and do you try to provide foods that would be not only healthy but taste good and have that kind of diversity represented in terms of the menu?
That is the beauty behind the My Way Cafe, is it making it, the child makes it their way. So the things that we are looking at is that we started out in East Boston, is that we are continuously changing our menu to incorporate the feedback from the students. So part of that is also not only just having base items such as either pasta or rice or a meat entree or a vegetarian entree, but it's also providing items after the child has gone through the line, such as including spice bars or things that or sauces that they can make the item more that meets their needs, whether a little more spicy or a little more flavor, those kinds of things.
Thank you, Laura. In terms of transportation, I wanted to come back to the 50 buses. You said there's a reduction of 50 buses. Did we see then a reduction in staff or routes, or how did that translate, those 50 buses?
In terms of staff, we worked closely with the drivers' union to make sure that there were no layoffs from the reduction in the fleet. However, we did enter the year with fewer drivers as a result of that. And as for...
So, help me understand, fewer drivers but no layoffs?
Yes, we negotiated severances for those drivers would have otherwise been affected by route reductions.
Okay. And when you say that 2,000 students are not riding the yellow school bus regularly, how are you defining regularly?
What we did last year when we began this opt-out campaign is we asked schools to look at their rosters of students for each bus assigned to that school and to let us know which students on each roster they had never seen on the bus all year long. So
At what point, though? Was that in October or November?
that was last spring. That was
Okay, by
around
spring.
April, May, June last
So
year.
they went from September to the spring of the following year, never have ridden the school bus, according to the staff?
Correct.
And that's-
We did,
okay.
yes, correct. And we did the same thing this past fall to determine within a month of when school started the exact same thing.
And with the increase with door-to-door, what is that just a cost increase, or is that an increase in number of students?
The number of students has gone up about 6.6% over the last 5 or 6 years.
Okay. And with the homeless students, is that an increase over last year? That 6.4 million?
Yes, so right now we're projected to transport around 610 homeless students into Boston. The figure last year was 457.
And in terms of, working with charter schools or parochial schools around, so you have to provide transportation based on what the state says. How have either of those systems, I'll use the word system, even though they're not systems, how have they adopted to BPS? Have they adopted the assignment, the transportation plan that you're using in terms of these smaller geographic zones? Or is it still just they expect citywide from, Mattapan to East Boston?
The private parochials operate according to the zone system. That was the three-zone system. That
So the
was
east,
an
west,
operation.
and north.
The east, west, and north, exactly, yes. The charter schools are citywide, however. And I misspoke just to provide some clarity on the door-to-door population increase. The annual growth rate is 6.6%. If you look at the actual percentage change from FY12 to FY18, I believe it's closer to 30%.
So the parochials are the three zones.
Correct. Charters are citywide.
And how many of the charter school students are actually utilizing citywide, like long, more than 2 miles, 3 miles in terms of transportation? Do you have that kind of analysis?
I don't believe we have that analysis in front of us. We can always get that back to you. For obvious reasons, they are more apt to have a longer transportation scheme than a Boston Public School student would, simply because they are citywide by nature and they're not confined by home-based assignment.
Right, but when we hear, when there are meetings involving the Boston Compact, or when there were discussions around, a universal kind of enrollment, there was always this suggestion that there was a willingness of charter schools to be more aligned to what BPS was doing in terms of transportation. So are you saying that that's not actually bearing out, that it's still just kind of all over the place?
As of right now, yes, that's what's happening, yes. It is worth bringing that idea back up to the compact, for example, or to our charter partners to determine if they would be amenable to applying the same type of structure that we have to assignment in Boston Public Schools. The other thing that's caused a small issue in some cases with charters is the geography of the charter school changes more frequently than it does with district schools. And in fact, there was a school not long ago that was in Brighton that's now in Dorchester. And that's then caused massive transportation costs and very long commutes for the children on those buses.
And just a couple more. Do I still have time or no? Okay, well, I'll come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, John. Thanks for coming out and your team. Just a couple of questions here. John, can you explain to me the different transportation types? I mean, I think I have an understanding of it, but corner bus, MBTA, and MBTA. Will you explain those MBTA relationships to me? What is our cost of the MBTA? Is there any cost? And the straight MBTA, it's mostly sixth graders through high school. do we give them the Charlie passes, or what's our cost there?
So the cost that we bear in providing MBTA passes for students in 7 to 12, we do have some sixth graders on T-passes as well. I believe it's $28 per pass, $29 per pass per month for students over 10 months. So on average, it costs us $290 for every student as long as they're eligible. For the 7th and 8th graders receiving T-passes, they need to live outside of 1.5 miles from school. For 9 to 12, they need to live outside of 2 miles from school. If they meet those eligibility criteria, they receive a pass. One good thing I would note is if they do not avail themselves of that service, the T will not charge us for that pass for that month. And so the charges are applied to us retroactively at the close of each month.
To see who's using the passes?
Exactly.
Okay, and so what's the difference between corner bus MBTA and just straight MBTA bus?
The corner bus MBTA simply means that for many of our high schools in particular, we have shuttle bus service. And in order to get to the shuttles, many times students will take the MBTA to, for example, Andrew Station. And they'll get on a shuttle bus from Andrew Station that will take them to a number of different high schools. There are different shuttle buses for different schools.
And
Forest Hills, Andrew, a number of other hubs across
That
the
leave
city.
from hubs?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So when we changed, when we went to the different districts, it was about 5 years ago, it was before you guys, we, was there any savings there? Did we actually create any walkers under that plan, or did it just stay the same? Same amount of kids on the buses just being bused to different places?
Similar to the question that Councilor Asabi George asked earlier related to extended learning time costs, sometimes it's hard to isolate these variables from a sea of other factors. We do see that there has been an increase in walkers over the last several years. We do see that the average enrollment dispersion is the term that we often use. The average enrollment dispersion for our schools has started to drift a little bit closer to where the school is. However, because we're still grandfathering transportation for students who entered the school from the previous assignment system, and maybe more important, because we're allowing siblings of those children to be grandfathered until they're completed with their schooling, what we're seeing right now is that the areas where our schools were drawing from before are now less dense, but they're still there. So if you consider it this way, there might be a school in Hyde Park that's drawing, maybe years ago was drawing many students from South Boston. It now wouldn't be drawing the same number of students, but it's still drawing a small number of students.
Enough where we're still sending
enough where
buses
there's
there.
still costs associated with transportation. So the move toward home base did not save as much from a transportation perspective as I think people may have surmised at the time.
And to talk about the transportation for the homeless children, it's gone up by a couple hundred kids, up to 600 or whatever. Is there a long-term plan there? So if they're homeless originally from Boston, but they end up in wherever they end up, if they end up in more stable housing in those surrounding communities, will they be transferred into those school districts? Do we have any sense of that? What's the planning around that, or we just have to take it case by case?
From my understanding, if the family wishes to remain at their school of origin, then they can continue to do so until their time at that school has complete, until they graduate.
Even if their status is not necessarily homeless anymore?
I can't speak to how you would establish permanence in another location. I can imagine that when you do that, you may then sever that obligation that the school district has to provide the transportation. We can follow up with you on that.
Yeah, okay. How many bus drivers do we have?
It's a little bit confusing. The reason why I say it's confusing, we have 608 bus routes on the road. We actually have 852 bus drivers. However, as of the last count, 107 of them are on a long-term leave of absence, 51 of whom have never actually driven for the current vendor. But because of a collective bargaining agreement restriction, they're still on the books.
We're still carrying them.
Yeah. We also have to carry a mandatory 14% standby rate of drivers. That means however many bus routes you have, you need to carry that times 14% of additional drivers to act as standbys available in case of need. Because of attendance challenges that we often have, the number of available drivers is far lower than what that standby rate would imply. Knowing that we're making changes this year, we intentionally went into the year with a 20% standby rate, which, as you can tell, is a good ways higher than the 14% that we're contractually obligated to provide.
But you needed them to make sure that the routes were covered?
Yes.
Okay. What is exception time?
It's exception time, forgive the term because it's not very self-explanatory, but, and John or Ed, you can weigh in after this, but exception time is when a driver performs a route for longer than the route has been designated to perform under. So for example, if you were a bus driver and you should be leaving the yard every day at 6 a.m. and get back by 10, your route is designated as 4 hours. If you get back at 10:30, then that's what's called 30 minutes of exception time, because it's an exception to the designated time in the route. But we then need to pay you for that time, whether it was traffic-related or other reasons.
I'm sorry.
Oh.
Can I come back to you?
Sure.
Unless it's one quick one.
Well, you threw me off, so no, we'll have to. Thank you.
Thank God for small favors. Councilor Presley.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. And a special thank you on the food and nutrition service side. Dr. Benavides, I am so proud to have played a part in the poaching of you from California. You've been an incredible contribution, and as I tell the story often, when Superintendent Chang came on board, and my first meeting with him, this was the #1 item on the agenda, and he said, I knew you were going to ask about this. Everyone told me your commitment to improving the quality of school food. I had the food myself today, and we can do better. And so the good news is we are doing better, and I just want to commend you and the entire team and the superintendent for putting you as an equal partner amongst all other cabinet members, because certainly our ability to improve outcomes begins with student readiness to learn, and that has everything to do with what they're fueling their bodies with. So we have partnered on many things, from the vendor contract hearing to parent and student taste testings to menu working groups to culinary arts challenges. And so again, I just thank you for your partnership, and the lion's share of my questions are going to be in this space. But again, kudos to you and the entire department.
Thank you.
Okay. So my first question is, could you tell us if ultimately there is a plan to return to a central kitchen, or will we just expand out this hub and spoke sort of model?
That's a great question. I think as we are looking and exploring more and more information of how the hub and spoke project is working, we are seeing it as a mini central kitchen where the hub is East Boston High School, and it's providing meals out to 3 other schools that were previously satellite schools that we built out to be central kitchen, to be their own small kitchens. So in modeling that and thinking through how that would expand across the district, that is still something that's still in the works. It's not an official process, but it's something that I'm still continuing to evaluate, because
whether or not we should return to a central kitchen?
Correct, because
Okay.
it would be really, truly to be by Boston, for Boston. We want to be our own ecosystem of how we provide our meals to children.
Exactly. So that was my next question. So how many of our schools are farm to school?
I don't know that answer. I have to get that back to you.
Okay. Well, I think, ultimately that's the goal here, is that, although we did work closely together, and, we're pleased to have a vendor that's providing, fresher and healthier food, love this model, the deconstructed meal, the students, making those personal choices about healthier eating. But I do see an opportunity here for the economy, our local economy. So I hope that that's the ultimate goal, is to get us to a farm-to-school model. So
I think it would also, I guess it would depend on how we define farm-to-school for Boston. So if it is that we are our own, again, ecosystem, then we'd want it to be 100% a
Okay.
farm-to-school district.
And then how are we currently handling our food waste? Do we have any schools that are composting? Is this something that we'd also like to see in the future? Is it a part of sort of a 5-year plan or future goal?
that is part of our plan to making sure that whatever we are utilizing, we can put it back into the environment so that we can continue to come back into our food systems. But as of right now, we don't have any, we have a couple of schools here or there that may do their own composting, but we don't have a district-wide plan.
Okay. And so then, you know, in our efforts to make the food more culturally relevant, more nutrient-dense, more palatable, it was our hope that ultimately that would mean that we would also see lesser food waste. And so I'm just curious, how do you quantify that? How do you determine what the level of food waste is, and do we see a drop-off?
We see more of the drop-off in sites where they're preparing their meals, because you can be able to make, when you're doing your production, and be able to utilize some of the items that you don't use, and you can use it the next day because you have proper facilities to store and to reheat and then to serve again for the next day. So that way, the waste is minimal. At locations where we do pre-plated meals, the waste is higher, simply because it is a fresher product and it has a very short shelf life.
Oh, I'm sorry, I meant previously we had a food waste problem because the kids were not eating the food. So that's my question is, are you able to gauge, are the kids eating more of the food?
It is, that is one of the measurements we utilize in the hub and spoke.
Okay.
And we are able to see that when children are actually eating, what they are choosing. So the consumption is higher and the waste is lower.
Okay, great. And then, you know, one of the things that I really appreciate was, you know, a demonstrated commitment by your department to strengthen the opportunity to hear from the consumers, from the students, you know, and that was why we agreed to have menus that would be more culturally relevant, right? And so I'm just wondering, is that feedback something that's still happening in real time from students in terms of menu offerings?
Yes, we continue to work with Project Bread as one of our partners that goes out and tries out, does a lot of taste testing for a lot of different menu items and recipes, and I can send you a schedule of what we have taste tested. And we want to get our goal is to get at least a 75% student approval rating before we put it on the menu for district-wide.
Okay, great.
And, okay.
Yes.
No, that's okay.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And then I'm just curious, you know, given rising obesity and things like that, and I do see all these things working together. So can someone tell me, are you required by law to make sure that every student has access to gym and is experiencing recess? Because I see all these parts working together. So can someone answer that? Is every child getting recess and getting gym?
I can't speak to that
Okay.
right now. I can make sure that someone gets back to you.
Well, so I'll bring it full circle. So on the federal level, how are we faring according to the guidelines that Michelle Obama, our former First Lady, rolled out in terms of the Healthy and Hungry-Free Child Initiative? Are we keeping pace in reducing salt and sodium? And so how should we talk now about what it is we're providing in order to combat childhood obesity?
So the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act under the Obama administration, which focused on increasing the amount of whole grains that we want to provide to students, as well as reducing sodium. They provided the reduction of sodium into 3 target levels.
Okay.
So the second,
Soda.
For sodium, for the second target level was due for districts this past school year. I'm happy to say that Boston moved forward with Target 2 removing the Target 2 levels of the sodium that was required through the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, even though through this current administration, they stated that school districts can actually remain at Target 1 levels.
I got you,
So
okay.
we move forward.
So we're moving forward
Yes.
while others are staying stagnant?
Correct.
Okay. And how would we encapsulate what the product is that we're currently providing? So no high fructose, or could you just tick that off for me?
Sure. I have my list. I want to make
Okay.
sure I have it correct.
Okay.
So we are focused on being as clean as possible, and we want to do everything we can for our labels to have that process. And so that would be no artificial colors, flavors, sweeteners, or preservatives, no high fructose corn syrup or trans fats. Our next biggest one is eliminating bleached flour and antibiotics. Those are our 2 big focuses.
Okay, great. And then could you also speak to me about culinary arts? Is there a chef curriculum? how many of our schools have some sort of culinary arts curriculum or training opportunity? And also on the food service side, as we're looking to move towards fresher, healthier, more deconstructed food, will we also be investing in the professional development of our food service workers? And it's my understanding that sometimes they feel, understaffed. I know you still have some positions to be filled. I'm just wondering if you're working with community partners like NECAT or others that could then get credit, towards their own program while also offering the extra hands needed in the kitchen.
Sure. So last year, we participated in the Cooking Up Change Challenge, which we will be participating again this school year. And we've invited 3 of the culinary programs that we know of in the district, which are at the Boston Day and Evening Academy, at the Madison Park Vocational, and also at Fenway High School. Those the 3 groups there will be participating in our contest next week. And it would be an opportunity for children to utilize all of our restrictions and our budget to make a menu
It was pretty good. Please extend an invite again.
Okay, I
thank
will.
you.
I will make sure you're on that list.
Okay.
And as we learned from the Hub and Spoke project, which is transformed into the My Way Cafe, clearly training is an opportunity for us to be able to invest in our staff, because it is very different from a process where you heat and serve.
Yes.
To where you're actually prepping, and then it's a lot of engagement with students, which is I think it's a wonderful thing. So part of that is, and even through with the support of the Shaw Family Foundation, they've introduced us to a lot of different programs and groups, including Pine Street Inn for employees that have had really a great culinary training that we can be able to incorporate back into it, but also they would offer their training processes for us, for our employees as well.
Okay, great. And then I thank the chair for his indulgence. My final question, unrelated to food, is I saw a bullet here about the MWBE spend, and it said see attached page, and I had difficulty, because it's just something we're just asking, given our shared goals to address income inequality and the wealth gap, and Councilor Wu and I had worked with the mayor to pass an ordinance to strengthen the city's spend when it comes to MWBE, vendor and contracting opportunities. So I was just wondering if someone could answer that. I saw a slide here somewhere, or a bullet that I just, I can't seem to find the actual number. I will try to find.
I apologize.
I will
don't
try to
know what
find the
you're-
page.
okay.
I'll circle back. Mr. Chairman, if you want to move on. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Councilor Edwards.
Thank you so much. Luckily, a lot of my questions have already been answered, and I really appreciate your thoroughness. I wanted to also congratulate you on the school lunch endeavor. I think that's actually where we met, in East Boston, which is in my district. The food was excellent, and I see you have a picture of me eating it yeah. So that was a true smile, honestly, meeting the kids and just seeing their genuine joy. To see them be excited about a school lunch was also something that was really, really satisfying, and it really brought warmth to my heart. So you guys are doing an amazing job, and to see it expand, so congratulations on that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some specific busing questions, and then also to pick up on some of the grade configuration questions. If I read correctly on page 25, there are 247 propane buses that you have. And I think there's a total of 600 buses that you use on a daily basis that do 1,500 trips. Right?
Roughly.
Okay, so just bear with me then. If 247 are propane, what are the rest? Are they diesel?
Yes.
And what is the move to increase the amount of propane buses?
I
Is there
don't know
one?
if you can
It's
speak to
cheaper.
that. We've been really a leader in school districts in making an early move toward propane-powered vehicles. I don't know if Ed, you can speak to that in a little more detail. I know Peter Crossan in the audience can share more
Every year,
detail as
whenever
well.
we go out for procurement for new buses, they're all propane. So we just started with an entire fleet of propane, and as we essentially recycle through buses as they age out, we're replenishing them with propane buses. So we're on our way, but
Yeah.
it just depends on how many we're retiring in a given year and how much budget we have to procure new ones.
Okay, so it's really not an intentional program or act to switch all of your buses to propane. It's just incidental. As you are replacing buses, you're just going to use propane. I guess for me, intentional would be, we have less than half of our buses are propane. We want all of them to be propane. The goal is to do this, and we will do it more aggressively than just waiting for buses to have to retire and us to get them as we need them.
We are intentionally going after propane. It's just the means and how we want to do, life cycle management with all of our buses is you want to do it in a cyclical kind of way. So you're not buying 600 new buses every 10, 15 years. You're buying it kind of inch by inch. So they are recycling in a more a cyclical kind of way. But we are doing it for the environmental. And then also in terms of noise, diesel buses are much more noisy. And then I've spoken to some veteran drivers, and they love it from even just a driving everyday, breathing kind of thing. So it is absolutely intentional.
And the one thing I would say just to briefly expand on that is that, yes, it is intentionally moving in that direction. We also try to make sure that our bus acquisition costs stay relatively flat each year at about 6% of our budget. If we were able to be more aggressive in pursuing a switch over to propane, it wouldn't be cost effective to do so insofar as that percentage would change dramatically and would lead to a spike in costs related to this that we would then bear out year over year because of the leasing costs after that.
So how many buses do you replace on a yearly basis on average?
It varies about 70 or so each year.
70 or so, and there's a little over 200 some odd left. So we're talking a long time before we have a full fleet of propane buses.
It could be another 4 years. It's hard to say.
Okay. When was the last time the city looked at costs of electric buses? Did you look at any attempt to move to that form of transportation? Did you think about it in terms of?
4 times the propane bus. 4 times. If we continue with propane, we could buy 4 propane buses at the cost of 1 electric. There's not an electric bus on the market that can go.
You know what?
Peter, if you don't mind coming down to the rostrum and announcing yourself, that would be great. Thank you. Peter Crossan is our fleet and compliance manager and one of the foremost experts in the state on the school bus industry. You can go right over here, Peter.
Peter.
Yeah.
I'm on the wrong side of the tracks again.
Pretty good hurdle.
And do I have a button here as well? We have been advancing, we've had 4 procurements, or we've had 3 procurements of propane buses, 86, 86, and 75. We plan on purchasing another 75 this school year. The models that we have so far have been purpose-built and engineered specifically for our operating conditions, which are different than most school districts. We only operate about 10 miles per engine hour, and we run double the number of hours as an average school district. We have looked at electric buses. We're not there yet with electric propulsion. They don't have enough endurance to go the entire day reliably, and most of the technology is new. Now that California has renewed their effort, the major players are getting back into the market. The electric bus cost about $250,000, and so we think the best way to proceed is to replace as many older buses as possible.
With propane?
That's correct. And the second thing I'd add is that at the end of this year, we'll have all 2010 emissions buses or newer, which are some 95% cleaner than the 2004 emissions. So our emissions are quite clean, and the days of diesel smoke or even odor have gone. But it's our intention to continue on propane.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was incredibly informative. In terms of the funding then for any other alternative forms, such as an electric vehicle, have you looked to the state for funds from the Volkswagen pollution settlement, from other ways in which to try and bring in other ways to pay for?
That's still in the process of being formulated. We have looked at those, but typically it's one bus, which is a relatively small purchase, and we don't feel that electric propulsion is there yet. We're much better from an environmental standpoint and an operating standpoint to purchase 3 propane buses and retire diesels and to purchase 1 electric.
Okay, thank you. Switching now to, thank you very much, to the, specifically within my district, I had a lot of calls and concerns about the BLA bus service from Charlestown, East Boston to the Boston Latin Academy. And again, I know I asked in February about its continuance. I know that it was a big issue before. I'm asking now again in May whether this bus will be discontinued or not, and what kind of advance notice our parents would have. Of course, I'd love for it to continue, but I want to know.
To my knowledge, that decision has not been made as of now. I do know that there was an equity analysis of shuttle bus service to all high schools conducted a little over a year ago by the Office of Equity at Boston Public Schools, and it was through that decision, through that analysis, I should say, that a decision was reached that that particular shuttle bus was not needed. It did not meet the same criteria that our other shuttle buses do at other schools. I do know that there was an awful lot of pushback related to that, that we then honored by supplying the bus again this year. Again, as I mentioned at the outset of my answer, to my knowledge, a decision has not been made on that yet. If we do decide to discontinue that, you're absolutely right. We would need to message that as soon as possible to all families, but that's not something right now that we've considered.
Yeah, I believe we got that decision in August of last year, and for a lot of families, that was too close to the start of the school year. So ideally, you would be telling us what your decision is. Of course, I'm going on record hoping you will continue the bus. But I really think it's, again, this is my second ask at a forum. We asked in February, I'm asking again in May for the decision. And finally, when it comes to the grade configurations, I just want to again note, it would be a huge difference for us and for a lot of East Boston students.
Bless you.
Because we don't have a middle school in East Boston. Many, I think it's as high as 70, possibly 80% of the Edwards Middle School are East Boston students who are bused over there. And so just to put it again about the grade configuration, if we were to get K-6s and K-8s, more of them in East Boston, it would keep, well, that's one way of saving a huge amount of money in terms of you wouldn't be busing a lot of our middle school age kids over into Charlestown. We would actually be able to save money and keep them in East Boston. So I just wanted to put that plug in again. If that's something that's considered. I know no decision has been, you stated that there is no change coming for configurations?
Not for this September, no.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. At our SPED hearing a few days ago, what came up in that hearing was state-involved transportation went up over 200% from 13-14 through this latest year, 17-18. And I received my information request, and it seems like there's almost double the amount of students going to Arlington, Walpole, like all different suburban towns, like one student here, one student there. That's got to be a tremendous cost driver. And can you speak to why is that increased so significantly in just the past 4 or 5 years?
The large part of it is the change in legislation. The McKinney-Vento Act that was passed about a year and a half ago now mandates that host school districts, I should say the origin, school district of origin for these children needs to continue to provide the transportation for that child through the end of their schooling if their family so chooses, as long as they stay in a transitional time or experiencing homelessness. That legislation was brand new about a year and a half ago. Prior to that, school districts would not have to continue that service beyond a certain point. I forget if that was through the current school year or after 90 days. I actually don't remember. I don't know if, Counselor, you might know the school year. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So that was changed to be a much steeper burden now for school districts to bear.
And we get zero reimbursements from the state on that? Are we bearing the entire cost?
So there are a couple, I'll answer that in a few ways. In terms of students who were in Boston, moved out, and were placed somewhere and are coming back in, we have the burden of paying 100% of those costs. And then additionally, For students that are currently in Boston, but we're shipping them out, the district where they are going sets up the transportation, but we're on the hook for 50% of those costs.
50.
And then on the outside, there's also McKinney-Vento reimbursement, which I believe goes back into the city's general fund.
Okay.
Yeah.
The 50% or an addition to the 50% from those out-of-district placements?
I'm not sure. I'll take it back to you.
It just seems to me that we're lowering our corner-to-corner, which is the least expensive transportation that we provide, and all of the costs that drive transportation costs up are increasing at a very high rate. 200% in 4 years is a significant rate. I don't know, how we address that, but it's certainly troubling. And, I'm seeing like 22 different placements in 17-18 that we didn't have in 13-14. And we're talking one student here, one student there, two students here. Uber might come into play in something like that, I would say. But, we have, what kind of how do we transport one student to Arlington?
Oftentimes, they're on a bus by themselves.
A half bus, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, typically, it's a smaller bus, not always, depending on when we need to reuse that bus, if they can
And
join
we
a
are
route later with
mandated to
more
do
kids.
this. We are mandated, so
Correct.
there's no flexibility here or anything else. Okay, great. Counselor, who's here? Asabi George.
Thank you. Can we just go back over the McKinney-Vento reimbursements? We're paying 50% of a student who is from another district living in Boston through transitional housing?
Yes.
And so,
We're cost sharing that with the district wherever that student is.
so then when our students are placed outside of the city, because we know there's about 600 of them that are living outside the city, is that district cost sharing with us?
We share, we set up that transportation. I'll have to look back to see kind of how the cost distribution works.
I mean, I hope it matches.
Yeah.
So if we could follow up on that.
I'm seeing a yes from the audience, yes. We are where it's the same, it's a 50-50.
It's the same, okay.
Could we ever either come down or?
Sure. Kristen, if you wouldn't mind coming down. What Kristen was saying is if the child is in the custody of the state through DCF, then we're responsible for 100% of the cost.
Okay.
If they're located elsewhere, then we share 50% of the cost.
So
with the
that's
district where they live.
state involved then?
Yep. So if the student is experiencing homelessness and lives outside the city, then we share a cost with the city where the student lives and their school of origin. And if they're homeless and living inside Boston but going to school in, say, Malden, then we also share the cost of that. If the student is in the care of the state and living outside the city, we pay 100% of the fee for transporting the student back into Boston. And I'm not sure if that's the same example that you're using as students living in Boston going to schools in Arlington. I don't know, I don't think that's the same thing.
Okay.
So we have students coming outside of the city who are in the care of the state. They're in foster homes, group homes, star beds, et cetera. That's 100% our cost.
What do those costs look like compared to other door-to-door service, for example, versus corner stops versus public transportation or?
I think we're going to have to get back to you on the specifics for that one.
But I guess my point is we're taking on more of the more expensive transports into the system and taking on those costs with, of course, no help from the state who mandates, unfunded mandates, if you will. And then we wonder why our transportation costs are going up 10, 20% a year. So anyway, I'm sorry. Is it?
You're the chair, but it's my turn.
Sorry, George, yeah.
I think that it would be helpful to have some clarity on the numbers because we have the 459 that are some state and not state-involved children. And then there's the 600 number of students who are experiencing homelessness or in the foster care system, which may be shared. And then there's the private sped versus the outside of the district. So there's just a lot of numbers. So I think just if we could, at some point, get some clarity on where our kids are going and how much we're spending to send them there, I think that would be helpful. Just a lot of, just there's a lot of numbers, and it can be a little bit confusing because some kids fit into multiple categories for that expense. I think regardless, though, it is very expensive, and I think that the accurate number is that 57,000, it seems like, is the average number for transporting.
For private special education students specifically, for the 166 students in that category, so to speak, whom we transport outside of the city, yes.
And then there's that number of students that are leaving the city for some sort of private placement for education, and that average number is the 85,000 that was sent over to us through a question. So we have a group of students that we're spending on average $142,000. And I was looking back through some of my old notes because I think it was just 2 years ago that we were spending on average about $108,000. So everything's gone up significantly. And it's not that some of these kids shouldn't be getting that, we shouldn't be spending it, but I do think that it's appropriate as we look at the budget to think about ways that we can create some savings. So whether it's creating that educational opportunity within our city limits, if there's some trends that we're seeing, that we should be providing those within the city limits. So, and I do want to say, while Kristen's up at the microphone, since over the last 2+ years, Kristen's done a really fabulous job of making sure that our students who are experiencing homelessness, that gap in service, that 7 to 10 days that it used to take to get a kid when they've been moved from one shelter to another, getting them set up with transportation as quickly as possible. Kristen's done a fabulous job. So I just want, while you're here, thank you for that. Another point for clarification, we've talked a lot about the 50 buses that we've taken off the road. It's actually 38 buses. We took 50 off. We had to add 12 back in. So just for the record, I want to make sure that is just set straight. How many drivers do we have on leave that are currently being paid? Because I think that question came up a little bit. I'm just.
It was 25% or something crazy.
Do we have a number of how many bus drivers are on leave?
You're talking about suspended with pay?
Suspended with
there
pay.
are multiple different leave categories.
Suspended with pay.
Suspended with pay, right now we have 15. Yes, right now.
And how many have we terminated over the course of this school year that were at one point suspended with pay?
Just one?
Oh, just one. Pleasantly surprised at that. Thank you. How much are we spending on transportation for BPS athletics?
Yeah, we may have to get back to you on that. That's not typically something that we prepare for this presentation. I apologize, but we'll take a look at that. I know the athletics department would have just met with you all last week as part of the asset team, but we can get back to you.
Great, and I just, there are challenges every year with making sure that we have enough buses to get our kids to games and practices if they need that transportation for that.
Yeah, one thing, just sorry, on that note, one innovation that we're trying to expand upon is to work with our drivers union to allow some of our retired drivers to come back as drivers for our charter trips. In some cases, we struggle with service for our athletic charters because we don't have any drivers available. And so we're working with the union to try to see if our retired drivers can come back and drive some of those trips. Many of them would like to. It's a win-win for both us and the union.
Oh, great. I would be happy to hear that, too, because I know there were some concerns last year. What are some of the other innovations, because you had mentioned in your opening presentation that there are a number of innovations that you're working on with the MIT team. Could you share those with us?
Sure. At a high level, we plan on trying to reoptimize our bus routing for this year. We don't expect that would be quite as significant a move as what we took on last summer. And thank you for the clarification on the reduction of bus routes. We often cite the beginning of the year number. Last year, we started at 646. We ended the year at 654. This year, we started the year at 596. We're currently at 608. so it depends on the time of year when you discuss that. But we do plan on reducing the fleet further if possible through further optimization of our bus routes. We're working with MIT right now, as I mentioned before, on updating the travel speed within our map. That might sound like an overly technical and somewhat I don't know, bland innovation, but it's actually incredibly exciting for those of us who work in transportation to make sure that you're actually equipped with the tools to properly route buses and know how long they're going to take on which roads that they're traveling on. That's another innovation we're excited by. I appreciate the councilor's reminder about the push toward the out-of-district cost sharing. We're continuing to give that some thought and have built more conversations with the state on that note to try to broker some of those relationships. As I mentioned before, the opt-out campaign, we're going to continue to do what we can with opt-outs. And one thing that's still very much in its infancy stages that I referenced very briefly earlier is some work that we may be doing in our monitors unit to make sure that monitors, God bless you, that monitors are more efficiently assigned to buses in a way that links their trips more effectively so that there's much more reliable bus monitor service for our students who need those accommodations.
Great, thank you. And then I would also say, I know that the bell time conversation will eventually return. There are a number of schools, as you know, that were, a handful of schools, I should say, it was a small number of schools that were very happy with that change because they have gone back to the, year after year, they've been told that they would have a bell time change. I think it's, especially the 9:30 starts, have been told for a number of years that they would get moved up. Some of the very early times have been told that they would move a little bit later. And I just hope that, for those schools that later start time or that too early start time, but I think we have a greater occurrence with the 9:30 starts, that it has a very direct impact on enrollment, which has a very direct impact on that school's budget, that we continue to go back to that conversation, because families have unfortunately been told it would happen, and then it doesn't happen. So thank you for that. I'm going to switch gears to just my handful of food services questions, if that's okay. Can you talk a little bit, Laura, thank you for all of your work and really being invested in this work. Can you talk a little bit about the amount of reimbursement we've received from the federal government and what we've received, what we anticipate on receiving, and where it falls with our goals on those reimbursement dollars?
Sure. So we, excuse me, the graph that I had provided shows just what we anticipate to receive based off of our projected participation for breakfast and for lunch and for after-school meals. So we are seeing a decline in reimbursement for breakfast and a decline for, and my apologies, the graph.
So that revenue, the graph that you've given us, that's the federal, that's 100% federal reimbursement?
No, it won't, no. It's probably 98% of it is federal reimbursements, and the other 2% maybe some cash sales and possibly some cash that we, or maybe some rebates that we have, but other than that, the majority of it is.
Okay.
Yes, I can send you the breakdown of all of the information that we do have. So you can see based off of how many meals that we are planning to generate for breakfast and for lunch and for after schools, and how that populates into our budget.
So that variance, that $1 million, is what we didn't reach in our goal?
Correct.
And then what counts as participation?
Participation counts as when the child goes through the line. We offer 5 items. They take minimum at least 3 out of the 5. This is for lunch, 3 out of the 5, and they pass through and they put in their ID number, and we can physically see they've taken the 3 out of the 5, or even all 5, and they've gone through and sit down and they've passed through the line.
And what's the greatest challenge other than food choice? Because I know some kids don't particularly care for lunch. Is it the length of line or the length of lunchtime that's really creating, or lessening the number of kids that participate?
I think a combination is if we don't have enough points of service, or if there is only 22 minutes to eat, especially if you're combating that against recess, so the children just really want to get out and play versus coming in to eat. And sometimes even the rules that we have set up just historically of when you have only certain choices and you're required to take certain 3 out of 5 items, and if you only really want one, it just discourages you from participating. So it can be a combination through either physical logistics or actual rules that we have in place.
Can we get our kids to eat, I mean, we do the breakfast before the bell, breakfast in the classroom, have a lunch at recess or outside, get these kids if they want to go out, they've got to take a tray?
It's a trend that I don't like. I'm not happy that we're not seeing an increase in participation, especially with all the efforts that we put into it. The thought process is learning the trends and trying to do everything we can, but I'm open to any suggestion. I am a firm believer, and I appreciate breakfast after the bell and breakfast in the classroom because it creates real, true time access. But it does come with, logistics. It's a ripple effect. It impacts positively for students, but also making sure that the school has the culture to be ready to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Counselor Janey. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Counselor O'Malley. Sorry.
Oh, Council Campbell's gone. Okay, thank you. Thank you again. So I think it's slide 5. You went over this. I just want clarification. We transport, it's page 3, I'm sorry, non-BPS obligations. We transport 9,425 non-BPS students to 135 non-BPS sites. These are 22% of students transported, 50% of our sites served. So these, just to be clear, are charter schools, private parochial schools. Do we do private and parochial schools or just parochial schools?
Correct. We do. There are a couple private schools we serve, and then there are a number of parochial schools.
And then this would be out of district placement for students whom we can't service in BPS?
Correct.
Is there anything else that would constitute a non-BPS student attending a non-BPS school?
No.
And can we get or can you tell us now what the breakdown is? What is the combined cost of non-BPS students? And then, you may have this in one of the, apologies if I missed it, combined cost and then the breakdown by private, parochial, charter, out of district placement.
Yeah, so we have that information on slide 22. And what you have there is the number of students from FY17 to FY18 and the cost per student for 17 to 18 for each of those categories. So private special education we've referenced a couple times in this hearing today, and the average cost this year is about $57,000 per student.
And that increase is because?
The increase in private special education from FY17 to FY18?
Yeah, from 42 to 56.
Because the nature of that form of transportation with such a small number of students in such a wide array of sites we serve is much more volatile, if you will, than any other form of transportation that we serve. So for example, last year we had 147 students at a cost of $42,000. This year we have 166 students. One might think with more students, your cost per pupil would actually go down. But the nature of this service is such that with the 19 more students we had this year, it could actually be 19 more sites that we're serving, or it could be a number of other sites, or sites now that are further away than sites from last year. And so it's hard to...
I get that, John, and this isn't directed towards you, but this is just what I don't understand, because for many years we seem to be decreasing that universe of students. It's now growing again. I understand there's this whole increase of court involved or state involved, but I mean, is that true that the 19 additional students that we're seeing from FY17 to 18 are at that many more schools?
I don't have that information in front of me. I know that we're serving, Ed, you had referenced it earlier. How many sites are we serving for the private special education? 166. No, 63. I'm sorry, yeah, 63.
63 different sites. So 166 students at 63 different sites. And last year we were 147 students at how many different sites?
We don't have that data point in front of us. We can get that for you.
That would be helpful.
And again, it oftentimes doesn't. It's not a linear relationship.
No, I understand that.
I understand where the sites are and where the students are going.
But I'm still waiting. So we have some folks from BPS here. I'm still waiting to get the breakdown on the non-private SPED. I don't know where they'd be classified, but our students that we're paying to go to Minuteman Regional and Norfolk Aggie, those students aren't reflected in this, or would that be considered private SPED?
I actually don't know. I'd have to follow up on that.
Because that is, I think that per pupil cost was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, so I would assume, huge, I mean, much higher than anything on this page, so I would assume that includes transportation, but we'll follow up on that. Unless, does somebody here know that wants to come down?
My assumption is it doesn't include, it includes more than just transportation if it's over $100,000.
No, I know, but so why wouldn't that, but that is in a whole different spreadsheet than what you guys have today?
I imagine so. I'm sorry, I don't have that.
Okay, well, if we can get that information, that would be great. Thank you, Councilor Edwards, for bringing up electric vehicles. There are obviously a whole slew of incentives for a individual to buy or lease an electric car that make it more cost efficient. Does such a thing exist for municipalities or for the government as we talk about buses? I don't know. Our friend who I did enjoy his take. Because to this point, you know, I appreciate going to propane from diesel. It's better for the environment, but if we can look at even beginning with a couple of electric buses in our fleet, I think that would both send the right message, and we've seen propane costs increase by 24%. So there could be some cost savings. But do you know of any rebates that exist?
Actually, the program is in the process of being formulated right now by the state. We had some $82 million. How that's divvied up, I have participated in a couple of conference calls.
Yeah.
The product is not where it needs to be.
Understood. Because you need a car that's going to, I assume, how many hours a day is a bus on the?
On average, we're about 8.5 hours.
And how many miles has that traveled?
About 10 miles an engine hour, on average about 80 miles.
Yeah.
So the product is coming along. Most of the development's been aimed at California, which is large rear-engine buses. The only product that's currently available for us is really built by a backyard shop, and the product itself, it's not the propulsion that's the problem, it's the product itself. From a cost standpoint, propane has gone up this year, but it's been far less volatile than diesel. You know, we're now exporting fuels that we did not before, but it's still, you know, running close to $1 a gallon less. Gas, on the other hand, anything that our power plants are powered by gas, no matter what pipelines we build, we're at the last spigot on the pipeline. We still import most of our gas, so electricity is not, from a cost standpoint, more efficient or more cost effective. You know, we continue to want to get the fleet emissions down as a total, which is why we pursued propane.
Yeah, but are you saying that electric buses are not more, I repeat what you just said there, because I don't.
Well, electric buses are, first of all, about 3 times the price of a propane bus.
No, I'm sorry, what you just said specifically where you said natural gas fuels electricity, which means.
And we have the most expensive electric rates in the country, and we don't yet have a product that would go a whole day, and we have a battery life in commercial service that doesn't extend 5 years, so there's about a $30,000 price increase.
I get that, and I am
And
weighing my role as a fiscal steward of this city with my role as an environmentalist, and I appreciate your point. I am hopeful with the incredibly quick advances in electric vehicles and the incredible dropping price of electric vehicles at all levels that this is a conversation a couple years from now.
Yeah, it really is probably about 5 years off where the product's at a point. You know, we think the best thing for emissions is to retire diesel buses. And we're doing that at a much more rapid rate with propane.
Okay, well, that's certainly one step and a good step, so looking forward to seeing additional steps from that. How am I doing, Mr. Chairman?
You're good.
Okay, good.
10-minute round.
Oh, perfect, okay. Door-to-door to corner students. Do we have students that are originally slated to be picked up at their door that then, as they get older, for a whole host of reasons, that can then transfer to being corner students? I don't know if I'm phrasing that right, but I think you got the gist of my question.
I understand what you're saying. Yes, we do have students who do transition in that way. The ultimate goal of special education nationwide is to be able to serve students in the least restrictive environment possible. And so, yes, one of the core goals for special education is to allow that to happen. I don't believe it happens at a very significant rate. What I can say, though, is that one of the other innovations that we launched in partnership with special education last year is a refinement to the way that door-to-door accommodations and other accommodations are meted out at the school level. A new accommodation that we now have in that system is what's called accommodated corner. so that we might not pick you up at your door. You might be on that first step away from needing that service, but not quite at the level where you could walk the quarter mile to get to the bus stop. And so we're calling it closest corner or accommodated corner to allow for that transition to happen in phases if need be, or directly to accommodated corner instead of door-to-door at the outset.
To your knowledge, do any urban school district, so we have a unique situation with our school transportation that most other cities don't have.
Correct.
Do any cities refuse to offer door-to-door even for kids with other than the extreme accommodations, but do you know of any district that in the United States that may have another approach to picking up students that need special accommodations?
I do not.
I mean, would it be would it be a significant savings to I won't say abandon door-to-door pickup, but to significantly streamline it so that we have more of that accommodated corner? Because that sounds to me like something that could save money and could also help the student in the long run. The notion, of an inclusion classroom is sort of a rising tide lifts all boats. Is there any data points to suggest that could actually help actualize some savings?
It would, without a doubt, it would lead to significant savings. Our average cost for a door-to-door student in district is close to $10,000. Our average cost for a corner student is closer to $3,000. An accommodated corner,
split the difference.
Well, it's not even splitting the difference. It's much closer to a corner,
Yeah.
right? We have a lot of door-to-door locations on one-way streets or on tight streets across Boston that we need to get down and then back up and come back out with the bus. All of that is time, and time is money in the world of transportation, so certainly it would be significant savings. We're working with special education to try to do that and to try to make sure that their staff who are assigning these accommodations are as equipped as we are with the knowledge of the cost impacts of what happens with these assignments.
And I would, so that's positive to hear, John, and I appreciate that. And I want to be clear, I recognize certain kids are going to need the door-to-door accommodations. Of course, we all know that. But I did feel I have heard repeatedly some parents who have a kid that gets a door-to-door pickup say, we don't need this. And maybe they've expressed it, maybe they haven't. But this could be something to watch. And I know you are watching and looking at that. So
yeah, we in fact just recently identified a good number of students who, by their special education status alone, don't necessarily warrant door-to-door accommodations, and so special education is going to help us in discussing that with the families involved to see about removing that accommodation. Once that accommodation is in an IEP, it's extremely difficult to remove that. As a parent of a child, as a parent who's gone to these IEP meetings, they tend to be very, very tense, and so we need to honor that and honor the needs of the family with the needs of the school district.
Yeah, no, it's definitely complicated. And then I know, Councilor Asabi, George had asked you, and I think we'll get some more information on the after-school athletics, but can you just generally walk me through what the process is for sort of BPS providing transportation for after-school athletics at the varsity level, at the junior varsity level, club level? Like, how does that work?
John, if you can speak to that.
Sure. The peak hour to transport the athletics between 1 and 4 is done by existing drivers that maybe the standby drivers that we talked about, the 14%. Then the return trip is usually bidded out. So drivers every day will sign up, and there's a bidding process that they'll bid on work to take the return trip. So, but the key piece there is the peak charters that are between like 2 and 4. That's,
and if no, is it like a police detail? If no one bids on it, then it may not occur.
That's the struggle. So if no one bids on it, then we don't typically have any problem with the 4, 5, 6 o'clock return trip. There are drivers that will bid on it. That's fine. It's the 2, 3, 4 o'clock that's problematic. So what we've been doing is being creative. If a driver can do it and then start the trip, the 2:30, 3 o'clock hour, we package them together. So there's a lot of packaging done because that's where it's problematic, is during the 2 to 4 hour to get them to the event.
And I know Boston Latin School is in the dual county league, which is different. Are any other schools in other leagues that could pose some transportation problems?
I'm not sure.
Okay. I believe that Boston Latin is the only one that participates in a different athletic conference, but certainly we do have schools within our own athletic conference who do travel outside of the district for random non-league games, if you will.
Yeah, okay. And then, so there are currently 15 Veolia/Transdev bus drivers who are suspended with pay. And is that something that we can address during the contract negotiations that will present themselves this year?
Certainly.
And do we know what the cost, what the cumulative cost is of salary and benefits that we're paying for that?
What I can tell you for the month of April alone, the cost of that was $54,000 for the wages of the drivers who are suspended with pay.
Okay.
I believe that's correct.
So this is obviously very significant.
The average length of time for a driver suspended with pay is 22 days. We're continuing to work with Transdev and ultimately with the union, really, to make sure that we're shortening that window as much as possible and to get those drivers back on the road.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all for this.
Just to follow up on the bus driver, was I correct in am I correct in recalling that on any given day, about 25% of the workforce doesn't come to work for one reason or another? I seem to remember it was a strikingly large number. And to Councilor O'Malley's point, can we have, kind of clawbacks if people don't show up to work, on the union side? If your members don't show up at a certain level, that we kind of claw back some of that revenue?
If you would mind, sorry, elaborate a little bit more on what you're suggesting about clawback.
If I recall, it was a strikingly large percentage of the entire bus workforce that didn't show up to work on a daily basis, which I know creates catastrophic confusion, I would think, of trying to cover these routes now. Can't we impose some kind of, like if 17% of the workforce calls in sick, like you don't get reimbursed so much? And again, kind of goals to reach, goals reversing that trend of a quarter of the workforce not showing up on any given day.
Certainly, I think it's fair to say that more needs to be done to ensure more reliable attendance among our bus drivers. And I'll pause on that note to mention that the vast majority of our drivers are excellent at what they do. They're very caring. They're very consistent, reliable.
And I'm not trying to imply anything other than the fact that 25% of any workforce not showing up on any given day, no matter where they work, is troubling to me.
Correct. No, without a doubt, that's true. And so we're trying to work with Transdev and ultimately with the union to make sure that the driver attendance issue solves itself. If we consider the clawback approach that you're suggesting, and I think you and I right now are just brainstorming a little bit on this. If we were to explore that, my fear is that it might be punitive for the driver who actually needs to be out the next day because of a very legitimate reason. Now, that said, we do fear that there are some drivers on a regular basis who are not present for, who are not absent, I should say, for legitimate reasons. And we're trying to work with Transdev and the union to curb that. I know in terms of a recent snapshot that we got, knowing that questions like this oftentimes come up, we had 30 unexcused absences on one given day. In addition to that, we had 66 other drivers who were either suspended with pay, suspended without pay, or were on a formally recognized leave of absence. That then does not include other drivers who are on paid time off or other leaves of absence like grievance day, bereavement, jury duty, things like that, nor does it include the 107 drivers we mentioned earlier who are on long-term leaves and make up the total number of 852 drivers, but never actually show up to work. And again, nothing against the union or the drivers. It's just something that we need to work on.
Right. Okay. Councilor Jane.
Thank you. Just in terms of, so Laura, thank you again. In terms of the list of schools that you're going to get me for Roxbury, could you also indicate which are the hub schools and then the schools that those hub schools would be serving in their area when you get that list? In terms of transportation, I wanted to come back to the door-to-door. And on page number 5, My little key at the bottom is cut off. If you could let me know what the dark green, light green, and blue represents.
Sure, I have that here. The dark green represents the charter transportation costs.
Okay.
The light green represents charter MBTA. So just as we provide MBTA passes for BPS students, we also do the same thing for charter. The dark blue, which is hardly visible in the left-hand column, but somewhat prominent on the right, that's our private special education students. Those are assigned to facilities outside of Greater Boston. And the light gray is private parochial.
Oh, gray. I didn't even see the gray. Okay. So, you know, what I've observed over a number of years, having followed the transportation budget in particular, are a lot of questions and concerns around the choice portion, which steadily, as we've seen, has been shrinking over time, in part because of policy changes within the district. So going from zone-based to home-based, putting middle school students on the buses, on the MBTA buses. So that's gone down, and from here, you could see the percentage of students almost the same as the cost. You know, the door-to-door, you know, building on what Matt O'Malley was sharing earlier, I hear stories all the time about students who receive door-to-door, who are able to take, you know, older students who are able to take public transportation. Now, certainly if there are students who need and require door-to-door service, they should receive that. But there are just stories that I hear of, you know, either parents or young students themselves who enjoy, you know, going to the movies with their friends on the weekends on the T. They like the freedom and independence that provides them, but they still get door-to-door. How often is the administration really looking at who gets door-to-door and doing so in a manner that, you know, involves the parents? I hear you have this new closest corner that you're working with special ed. Are you also working with the Office of Engagement? How are parents being informed of this new direction that you want to go in? How are parents involved at the actual IEP meetings and understanding, you know, the benefits of a child or a young person being able to kind of have that freedom and autonomy to take public transportation if, in fact, they're able and ready to? So how are parents? I heard you say you're working with special education. How are you working with parents?
Oftentimes that would be introduced to parents during the IEP process at the school level. And I can tell you that the next training for all of our special education coordinators is happening this Thursday, May 10th. Special education is hosting that and has assured me that they will make prominent on the agenda these issues related to making sure communications with families are much clearer, making sure that we're only assigning accommodations to those students who truly merit those accommodations, and really just trying whatever we can to shore up those conversations with parents so that they understand why their child might not be given a transportation accommodation that they had before, or that they think that they merit, which special education doesn't, or they might learn in those meetings a little bit more about accommodated corner. It's not something that we've engaged with the Office of Engagement on as far as a more broad communication district-wide, because it's still only relevant for a small percentage of our total student body.
So I would, I guess, suggest to you, if that is the only place it's being introduced, then oftentimes those meetings can be, parents can experience them as being hostile, and so if that's where it's being introduced, I'm not sure you're going to get at what you're trying to achieve here. I would suggest that you, if not the Office of Engagement, clearly there is the Special Education PAC, there are other advocacy groups that are working with parents of students with special needs that could be engaged in this. And again, through the lens of if a child requires and needs door-to-door, they should absolutely receive it. But to only introduce it at an IEP meeting, it doesn't seem to me that you would get the desired outcome just based on how those meetings can often be hostile and intense. So I would encourage that, and certainly more analysis and a better understanding of what the district sees as the number of students who would be ready to move away from door to door, whether it's the accommodated corner or something else, just if you have those numbers. I'm also interested in what the demographic breakdown of these students are in each of these buckets. So understanding just, charter school, I'm assuming are largely students of color with that transportation. But just all of these buckets here, if you could have a breakdown, that would be helpful to me. Who's responsible for monitors on school buses for charter schools or parochial schools that are getting transportation? Are those BPS employees?
Yes.
Okay, because I've had a charter school parent report to me that there was an incident regarding a bus monitor and a student. That sounded very concerning, and I wasn't clear as to whether that was an employee of the charter school or BPS. So that's good to know.
In some cases, just as a clarification, I apologize for the interruption. In some cases, the charter school may have one of their own employees functioning as a monitor if we didn't have a monitor that day, or if they feel more that the bus needs an adult presence. It might not be a monitor per se. A monitor is typically the language we use for students who have it through a special education process. In other cases, people use the word for an adult to provide supervision or oversight on the bus, so to speak. So I don't know this particular case.
Yeah,
Most likely it was
I don't
BPS
have a lot
employee.
of details on that either, but I was just wondering if it was BPS or who's responsible. On the shuttles, you mentioned that there's some schools that have shuttles. Which schools are those?
I don't have the list in front of me, but a large number of our high schools receive shuttle bus service. For example, West Roxbury Academy and Urban Science Academy in the far southwest corner of the school district. I believe at last count they had up to 17 different shuttle buses serving that site last year. A number of other schools, particularly the high schools, are receiving shuttle bus service.
And for what reasons would they be? I understand why West Roxbury would, but why would other schools require a shuttle? What are the reasons?
The criteria that typically has been used, and Peter Crossan is going to come down to speak in more detail to this, but the criteria that's been used oftentimes in the past has involved the length of time that it would take students to get to that school, the number of transitions via public transportation, for example, in addition to other sort of complications that we would need to consider that would make life difficult for the students getting to that school. Peter, yeah?
Yeah, there are three different reasons. One, as John mentioned, was how long it would take. There are some places in the city that you can't get from here to there in time. Typically, we don't let we make arrangements if students have to take more than 3 buses or 3 connections. That doesn't work well. And then we supplement the MBTA's supplemental trips. The MBTA runs 201 trips for us a day. But there are locations like with BLA with 1,800 kids, with so many kids going through Forest Hill Station, they run service to BLA, as do we. And we have several buses that go to West Roxbury because there's not sufficient capacity. And we also have some oddball stuff that would go in a direction that no T-bus would go. So most of them are designed that way. Most of them have been long-standing for quite a long time.
Thank you so much. On the bus drivers, how many took the severance when there was a reduction in the buses?
It was 22 or 23. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly what it was.
And with the 15 that are currently suspended, were they all suspended together as a bunch, or it was over? So what's the average length of a suspension out of this group of 15?
22 days.
Okay. And with the charter school students, I'm really interested in understanding how many students are going to how many different schools, how long those trips are, how much that's costing, how long they are in time, how far away in terms of miles, like all of that analysis. I'm very much interested in seeing that. If you could provide that, that would be helpful.
I can tell you that it's roughly 7,400 students receiving transportation to 29 charter schools. That's not all via yellow bus. I believe some of that is through the MBTA. But I did make a note of your comment before about their average length of commute and how that differs from the BPS average. We'll get that to you.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. And then finally, do you know if any of our students are using bikes to get to school? And do any of the schools have bike racks? And is the school department working with, I don't know, transportation around protected bike lanes?
We work with Public Works quite a bit on protected bike lanes, on ADA ramps that Councilor Flynn had mentioned earlier that was underscored over here. In terms of bike racks and students biking to school, I don't have the data on how many students are actually doing that. I know that last spring we had a ridership survey to determine how many students were getting to school via what means. We do have that, I believe, from that survey.
Was that through VSAC?
We can look that up. No, that was a survey that we launched district-wide to all families related to transportation, ridership, and school start times. And that was something that we unveiled shortly after the climate survey took place, and again, asking all families to take part.
Yeah, I'm wondering if any of the walkers, take bikes instead.
Yeah,
opt out of
we know that there
MBTA.
are some,
Yeah.
and we can get that data to you. In terms of bike racks, we know that several of our schools do have bike racks. I believe it was the Conley School in Rosendale, which just had a bike rack sort of celebration this past week in honor of somebody. I just
Never
can't
gone
speak
to
to
a
the
bike
specifics
rack
of-
celebration. That must be something. But
And then how?
can I'm sorry, Councilor Janey, but
Yeah.
last one.
Yeah, last thing, just on the bikes, how we ensure that students, have their helmets, that they are riding safely, is there education that goes along with that as well? So if we're celebrating bike racks, then I hope that we're also giving students the information that they need to make sure that they're being safe during their commutes, not just to and from school, but whenever they ride. Do you know if that's happening school by school, or?
I can't speak to that, Counselor. In terms of any education related to biking to and from school, I think that might be more of a school-level program that certain schools would endeavor upon based on the number of students they have bike riding to school. I can say that we're still very actively involved in the Safe Routes to School initiative. That's much more of a walking initiative where we celebrate twice a year these Safe Routes to School. Those of us in district leadership go out and join with the families and students in walking to school. We work very closely with the District Wellness Council, which is a multi-sector group of folks to really promote this across our schools. But again, that's much more of a walking initiative than a bike ride.
I did that for the Ellis School, which was my elementary school. I did that earlier this fall. That was great. This winter, January. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Edwards.
Question/issue to highlight, and I'm hopeful that maybe you'll be at the table to help us fix this, and BPS, being in operations. But one of the conversations I had recently was about teachers and their ability to actually get to school and park, and having spaces at the schools. I know in our district, they're very, very far in between, and a lot of teachers are actually late coming into class, and it's impacting how they're able to educate their kids if they're every 2 hours they're running out. So I'm just wondering if BPS and operations, is there something you can bring, or when we set the table again and talk with BTD, is there some way in which we can discuss teacher parking?
I welcome that conversation. I would love to be part of that conversation. I would love for you to be part of that conversation. This is a frustrating concern for many of our schools across districts. I know just as the two of you are here right now, we've had several conversations with Will Thomas from Charlestown High, in addition to other principals and headmasters in your district. We've talked to Erica Herman at the Gardner School in your district, Councilor Ciomo. It's something that is really beleaguering a lot of our schools. We need to work much more closely with the Office of Neighborhood Services and the Boston Transportation Department to make sure that we can find a way, because there's got to be a way, to allow our teachers to have parking access near schools during the school day. We did have, as I'm sure you're aware, a successful conversation over some time regarding the Edwards School parking lot to ensure that the teachers could park there, but we could also share space with the community in a way that's a win-win for everybody. I mean, we should be able to use that as sort of a proof point that we can make this work. We now have to do it on our side streets and those parking locations.
Right. So I look forward to it, and I'll follow up. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before I let you go for this hearing anyway, I think I heard you say earlier, Laura, that, the hub and spoke model is, bearing fruit, no pun intended, but also providing better nutrition and more cost effective. And we're still looking into a central kitchen. So can you kind of
Yes.
elaborate a little on?
So when we first started out the Hub and Spoke project, it was an opportunity to see how could we look at really efficient cafeterias that could provide meals to locations that do not. So in that time frame when we were doing the pilot, ended up with actually addressing and fixing facilities at kitchens that were satellite kitchens that now were what we call finishing kitchens. So they could literally be standalone kitchens by themselves. So it's more, now they had more capacity to do that. So there's always been conversations, and even before when I first started, about a central kitchen. To me, my question was, it's great we can do a central kitchen. It would be possible to reopen it. There'd be whole kinds of logistics, but the end result would be the same. It would just be a pre-plated meal.
And that would be the hub.
Correct, the hub.
Right.
But now, since in evolving this pilot, it now has the opportunity that we are now not only evolving the food, but also the way that food is received and prepared and served. So the expectation now is to look at reutilizing not only our central kitchen, but as a hub, but as like a distribution center. Because now the goal would be for every kitchen, every school to be a cafeteria, and would no longer be a distinction between cafeteria and satellite. So, but with utilizing the central kitchen as a distribution center or even some sort of a prep center, that we would be able to cut down our delivery costs because, that our current vendors. Distribution, it would be more in-house, but also I think it would be more inviting to others to want to be able to participate in our procurement processes, because we won't lay out that you need to deliver to 50 locations or 60 locations. Now it's one location. So that's the goal is it not necessarily a central kitchen, but more of a distribution / central location, so that we can be more cost effective across the district.
Right. And John, I just want to thank you. I know that, we have the issue with the Gardner in regard to the Hub and Spoke program. I want to continue to work with you on, looking at a rollout at some time in the near future. I have some ideas. There are some kitchens, like the Gardner might not be the appropriate hub, let's say, but there are other facilities in the neighborhood that may be that hub, and then continue to roll it out if it does, in fact, show better nutrition, less waste, more cost effective. So I want to thank you for working with me on that Gardner issue right now. And I also want to acknowledge that the information requests that we give you, which is quite a lot of information. We did receive some this morning. Not all of my colleagues might have received it, but again, I know it's a constant request and give and take, and you guys have provided us the latest information that I requested. So I just wanted to go on record saying thank you for that. And we will reconvene in about an hour for the second part of the operations hearing. This part of the hearing is adjourned.